Welcome to Understanding Duality Part 3, Existential Dualities. Finally, we've reached the end of our list. We've reached the most important part after Part 1 and Part 2, which I assume you watched. Go watch those if you haven't. Now we're ready to really dig into the most important stuff, and we're going to jump right in. This is the realm of metaphysics and spirituality. This is the most important stuff that you need to understand in order to understand all of life, how humanity works, and what reality is. And really, you also need to understand this to have a proper understanding of the foundations of science. We're going to be talking a lot about absolutes here and transcending relative into absolute. And so try to keep an open mind and try to stay with me, because we are going to be talking about things which are very paradoxical and counterintuitive. And now we're going beyond what the ordinary human mind is capable of understanding. And yet, at the same time, you can still understand it, but you need to approach it from higher realms of consciousness. So let's begin. First on our list is the duality between subjective and objective, or subject and object. This is a very tricky duality that is at the very heart of science and materialist metaphysics, and just the conventional dualistic way of seeing the world. So conventionally, we're born, and then we start to think like, well, there's me, and there's the rest of the world. I am the subject, the rest of the world is the object, and I can have my own subjective personal experiences, but then there's like objective facts, the objective universe out there, which is separate from me, the subject. And then let's go about doing science. And then when we start doing science, of course, we run into this tricky problem of like, well, is this evidence that we have for some scientific theory, is this evidence subjective evidence or is it objective evidence? And then, of course, within science, we like to privilege the objective over the subjective. Somehow, if it's a subjective piece of evidence, then somehow that's not really true or valid because it must be objective. Of course, not realizing that all objective evidence or any notion of objectivity whatsoever that you might have, and any objective objects, even, take a physical object like a chair or a table, it is only accessible to you as a subjective experience. And so ultimately, if you want to get technical, the only thing that there is subjective experience. There's no such thing as objectivity in the way that science or mainstream culture holds it as. So in fact, objectivity is couched within subjectivity in this sense. This makes the entire enterprise of acquiring knowledge and figuring out how reality works very, very tricky and very counterintuitive and twisted in unexpected ways. So for example, 100 years ago, with the development of quantum mechanics, what good physicists realized, the ones who were actually working on quantum mechanics and had an open mind and who were visionaries, people like Niels Bohr and Schrödinger, Einstein, Planck, and others, what they realized is that, wait a minute, the way we were doing physics before, and science as a whole before, where we were assuming that our measurements of the universe can be separated from ourselves and our instruments, as if there's like a physical object out there and I can just measure how long it is using a ruler. And it doesn't matter whether I'm a human or what kind of instrumentation I'm using, or consciousness doesn't play any role into this. No, what they discovered is it's all intimately entangled and interconnected. And most people today, 100 years later, still don't understand, most scientists today still don't understand just how radical quantum mechanics is. If you want to understand that in more depth, go check out my multiple-part series called Quantum Mechanics Debunks Materialism, where I go into a lot of depth about the details of that. It's a little tricky, but basically what they discovered is that when you're making a measurement of a molecule or an atom or some subatomic particle, the very fact that you're measuring it itself affects the object that you're measuring, such that you can't even say that there's a you and an object, or a measuring device and an object. They're literally one. It's all entangled. And that was, of course, a radical and very important discovery that still hasn't percolated through mainstream culture. People don't realize the significance, in particular, the metaphysical ramifications and the epistemological ramifications of this discovery. But the folks who were working on it, they understood. It was extremely radical, extremely radical. So what happens as you're going deeper into personal development and ultimately spirituality is that you start to realize that the line between subjects and objects literally starts to disappear, where once you thought it was unquestionable, such that literally a physical object that you're looking at, a table, a car, a cat, or your parents, somebody you love, another person, a clerk at the grocery store, you look at them and you actually are so conscious now, beyond ordinary human consciousness, you're now entering a non-dual state of consciousness where you literally perceive that person's face or that physical object as being not just an object, but also simultaneously a subject. So in a sense, every physical object in the universe is self-illuminated, self-knowing, self-aware. Awareness is not localized within a human being or a human brain or within yourself. Awareness is omnipresent and it's literally everywhere and everything, such that you aren't looking at the table, you are the table. Now, of course, it might not feel to you that way right now if you're only beginning this journey. That's because you haven't done enough concentration work and you haven't shifted your state of consciousness enough to realize this. It's a very radical shift. Requires quite a bit of concentration work to be able to access it. And so ultimately what you realize with spirituality, and the reason we call it spirituality at all, and why we call it spirit, is that the entire universe is one subject. It's a subject of itself. The subject and object are one. You can't split them apart. And this is quite counterintuitive because you might wonder, well, how could there be a subject without an object? Or how can there be an object without a subject? Well, it turns out it can. You can transcend subject and object into an absolute third kind, like we talked about in parts 1 and 2, which is absolute subjectivity. Absolute subjectivity. So that's absolute with a capital A, subjectivity with a capital S. And when you realize that, you realize, holy shit, everything is spirit. Everything is God. Everything is a subject. The subject was never located inside of a body. The subject was the entire room the whole time. Everywhere you go is the subject. You are the subject. There is only one subject in the entire universe, and that subject is God. That subject is looking through every being, every human being, every animal, every bacteria, every sentient and non-sentient creature across the entire universe. And if there are multiple universes, it's looking through multiple universes. There's only one subject, and you are that subject in this human form that you're in right now. And that's what you realize. And there you have transcended the subject and object with a lowercase s and a lowercase o. Next on my list, we have the duality of esoteric versus exoteric. This relates to how we understand religion. So when we talk about religion in common parlance, mainstream parlance, usually people, when they hear the word religion, they think of exoteric forms of spirituality, which just means that it's a sort of a materialistic, externalized version of spirituality where God is some bearded man sitting up in the clouds. There's an actual physical heaven you can go to after you die. There's a physical hell. There's a physical devil. There's a physical good and evil. The Bible is inerrant and absolutely true, and you must read the Bible because it contains the truth, all this sort of stuff. So it's a very externalized, gross form of spirituality. And of course, it turns a lot of rationally minded people off because you have to be pretty naive to literally believe in things like Noah's Ark and certain other mythical type stories that you can read in various kinds of holy books. You have to be pretty naive to take those literally. But what people don't realize is that there's the esoteric version of spirituality or religion, which is actually the kernel that is responsible for the existence of an exoteric. So what people don't understand is that you can't have an exoteric religion without an esoteric one first. And so that's how every religion began. Every exoteric religion, including Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so forth, they all began as esoteric. Esoteric means going inside. As Jesus said, find the kingdom of heaven within. That means it's inside of you. It's something you are. God is not out there in the clouds. You are God. That's mysticism. That's esoteric. But of course, these two are intimately connected together. And so it's not so easy to actually separate the esoteric from the exoteric. And so various kinds of pathologies result when people don't understand this distinction, and also they're not able to transcend it and to realize that it's not like one is right and the other is wrong. It's just that you have to put the exoteric practices of religion into proper context. And so ultimately, when you do transcend the subjective-objective duality that is present within exoteric religion, you discover esoteric with a capital E, true religion, religion with a capital R. And that religion looks almost nothing like what you imagined religion to be. All those negative qualities that you attributed to religion, like dogma and fundamentalism and violence and bigotry and ethnocentrism and racism and tribalism and us versus them thinking and morality and all these sorts of negative things that you attributed to religion with a lowercase r, you discover that true religion is the opposite of all those things. And then you really discover what people like Jesus or the Buddha or Muhammad taught. And it's the opposite of what you think they taught. And the only way you can realize that is by actually transcending these dualities. Next on the list is the duality of metaphysics versus epistemology. This is huge. I've posted some videos about this on my blog where I talked about how metaphysics and epistemology are connected. It's very important to understand if you're doing any kind of philosophy or intellectual activities, if you're doing any kind of serious science, this is so crucial to understand, and yet nobody really understands it. So what is the relationship between metaphysics and epistemology? As it turns out, they're deeply and intimately connected. And so what you can realize is that epistemology, or the pursuit of knowledge, is intimately connected with being. Metaphysics is the question of being. And then epistemology is the question of how do we know anything? Well, these are intimately connected, as it turns out. You can't separate them at all, the way that Western philosophy tries to do sometimes. And so what you discover is that actually metaphysics is an absolute, and that it's more fundamental than epistemology. And so literally, the distinction between knowing and being gets transcended such that you discover being with a capital B or metaphysics with a capital M, and you discover that it's actually by being things that you're able to know them at all. There's a lot more I could say about that, but we have to keep going because there's so many other items I need to cover on this list. But that's a super profound, that's a life-changing, a career-changing insight if you have that, if you understand what I just said there. But don't think that you'll grasp it in just a few minutes. This took me decades of study and practice to be able to transcend the duality of metaphysics and epistemology into metaphysics with a capital M. Now when I know something, I don't just know it with the mind, I actually become it, like physically. So I don't just know a chair, I am the chair. I don't just know God, I am God. And of course, so are you. Next on the list is chaos versus order, or disorder versus order. Oftentimes, these are pitted against each other. And oftentimes, religious people, they will put order up on a pedestal while demonizing and devaluing chaos or disorder. But actually, these two are just like the yin and the yang. They're completely interrelated, and you can't have one without the other. And so you can transcend this duality to discover order with a capital O. Everything in the universe is exquisitely ordered, including all the disorder and all the chaos. You can't just have order with a lowercase o that excludes disorder and chaos. You need to transcend that and realize that there's a delicate interplay between the two. For example, one of the most important scientific developments in Western science in the last 100 years was the development of chaos theory. And chaos theory, which I'm going to have an episode on in the future, dedicated episode, because it's a complex and advanced topic. What science has discovered in the 1960s and 1970s is that there's like a whole new branch of science. The science of complex, nonlinear phenomena. And what they discovered is that, in fact, most phenomena that science studies is chaotic. And chaos doesn't mean complete randomness. No. What chaos means is that actually there's a delicate order, but it's unpredictable, even though it follows very strict physical laws and rules. And yet it's still chaotic. And some of the most interesting phenomena in the universe are chaotic phenomena. For example, like the way that the human brain works. It's a chaotic system. Or the way that weather patterns work. It's a chaotic system. And it's quite difficult to predict, and that allows it to be creative and new and fresh and not just some rigid mechanical system, even though it still is a mechanical system. But at the same time, there's a certain eerie spookiness within the chaos. Within the chaos, there's sort of a deeper layer of order. And that's something we'll talk about in the future. Next on the list is destruction versus creation. People like to pit these against each other, and of course, creation tends to be elevated as the good one and destruction as the bad or the evil one. But of course, you can't have creation without destruction. These are intimately connected. And people just don't understand the profundity of this connection. See, to create a new life, an old life has to die, has to create space. So the only way there can be a new generation of human beings, for example, created is if an old generation is destroyed. Otherwise, there's going to be too many human beings. And of course, if you create too many human beings, that leads to the destruction of lots of human beings. Overpopulation leads to destruction, you see. So there's always this delicate balance. You need to create, but then you also need to have an outlet for all your creation to then get cleared out so that a new space is created. You create emptiness, so to speak, through destruction, which then allows for new creation. So it's the circle of life. And even if, let's say you're painting on a canvas, or you're writing with a pencil, let's say, it's very nice to have an eraser so that you can erase what you've written. Or it's nice to have some sort of whitewash where you can whitewash your old paint away so that you can repaint something that you painted. See, that's very useful. For example, within a computer program, if you're using something like Adobe Photoshop or whatever software you use to create stuff, there's an undo button. That's one of the most useful functions in the software is the undo button. It lets you destroy the thing you just created, which ultimately leads to a greater creation in the ultimate end. You see, how much worse would creations be on a computer if the undo button was destroyed? See? But some people, they get so hell-bent on destroying destruction. You see the paradox here? It's totally hypocritical, because people who value creation, really what they do is then they hate destruction, and by hating destruction, they want to destroy destruction. So of course they're hypocrites, but they're not aware of this. But even if they got their way and they were able to destroy destruction, what would that mean? That would actually weaken creation, because their notion of creation is creation with a lowercase c. And you can transcend this duality by realizing creation with a uppercase C, which is the whole of creation, which of course encompasses both creation and destruction together into an absolute. Creation is an absolute. So when we say that God is a creator, what we mean is, of course, that God is both a creator and a destroyer at once. God is a creator with a capital C. Got that? Good, moving on. Love versus hate as a duality. I think we've touched on this in the past, but let me touch on it again, because this one is so counterintuitive, it really throws people for a loop. Love versus hate. You might wonder, Leo, why does God allow hatred in the world? Why didn't God just make everybody loving? And if God allows hatred, doesn't that mean that God actually hates and that God isn't all loving? Why does God allow racism and genocide and murder and dictators and corruption? All this evil. Well, it's because the way that you're conceiving of love and hate is in their lowercase forms. You're thinking of love as a lowercase l, love, which is a very selfish form of love. So what you mean when you say love is you mean love that's good for me. It's like, I want to love the stuff that's easy to love. So I will love rainbows and butterflies and unicorns. I will love money when it comes my way. I will love sex when it comes my way. I will love when people love me. So, very selfish form of love. But then anything that happens in reality that doesn't suit my agenda or that impinges upon my survival needs, that I hate. That's bad stuff. If some dictator comes to power or someone enslaves me or whatever, then that's all bad. I gotta hate that. But see, that's what you're doing. You're hating. But God is all loving. Love as an absolute. God is absolute love. Love is not something God does. Love is something that God is. And of course, you are God, but you're not conscious that you're God. So you've separated yourself from God. And you did this because you are incapable of loving everything about yourself. See, you hate yourself. You hate your face. You hate your belly. You hate that mole on your back. You hate that hair that you have somewhere. You hate this and that. You hate everything. Look how much stuff you hate in the world. That's why you judge and you constantly criticize. See, you're incapable of being all loving. Love as an absolute, love with a capital L. If you want more information on that, go check out my in-depth episode called What is Love, where I go into a lot more detail. So it's possible to transcend hate and love into love as an absolute, love with a capital L. This is the very being of God. Love is synonymous with truth. And you can become directly conscious that you are love. And that's a hell of an insight, transforms your entire life if you can transcend this duality. In fact, this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of non-duality, is to realize not just that your emptiness, but that emptiness is identical with love, and that love is an absolute, and that everything that happens out of love, including all the hate. So what this means when you transcend the duality of love versus hate into absolute love is you realize that all the murder and rape and slavery and corruption and genocide that has ever happened has happened out of pure love. It's such a twisted mindfuck that it completely reorients your attitude towards other people and the world, because what it does is it demonstrates to you that all of your judgments are utter delusion and lack of sight. So when you become so conscious that you become conscious of an infinite number of causes that lead to the creation of everything that has ever occurred, then you become conscious that all of it happened out of love, and that all of it, including all the bad stuff, had to be there. See, God is so loving that it even loves hate. That's how big its love is. So if you really want to put your love to the test and to see whether you're capable of absolute love, don't love the easy stuff. Test yourself by trying to love the hard stuff. Find a person that you really hate and try to realize that that person is not separate from you, but actually that you are that person. Literally, physically, metaphysically, existentially, you are that person because you're all of creation. And so you can't hate anything because you are everything. Otherwise, you're hating yourself, which is idiocy and delusion. See? So to really be totally conscious of God is to be conscious of yourself as God, is to be conscious that you are love, that you are everything. By this point, you've transcended all these dualities. And at this point, your heart completely melts. All of your judgments disappear. They become utterly untenable. Because what you realize also is that love is just not some wishful thinking. It's not just some hippie, new age notion that, oh yeah, it's nice to love bad people. No. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm not just saying it's nice to love bad people. I'm saying you are all the bad people that you hate, and that literally you are creating them as God. So to hate them is falsehood and complete delusion. And it drives you crazy and it makes you suffer. See? But anyways, let's move on. Next on the list, alone versus together as a duality. Seems like these are opposites, right? Either you're alone or you're with other people. But not so fast. As it turns out, this can be transcended, and you can discover that because everything is precisely non-dual, all dualities merge, the distinction between self and other also must collapse, which means that there's only one being or thing in the entire universe, which is the universe itself. Universe. It's right there in the word. Uni, one, verse, word, one word. All of creation is one word, one thing, one object. So when you realize this, you discover that God is absolutely alone. Alone with a capital A. This is a stark realization where you discover that all of your friends and your family and all human beings that you've ever known, those that you loved and also those that you've hated, have all been you the entire time. Figments of your own imagination. In the same way that in a dream, when you're sleeping at night, all the people you encounter in the dream are actually your own mind. Just fragments of your own mind. And then you wake up from the dream and you realize, like, oh yeah, I dreamt up the whole thing. It was all me. Well, that's the case with your mother, your father, your family, your friends, and everybody you hate. It's all you. And you're totally alone. Which is why even when you're with your friends, you get the sense sometimes that you're with people, but you still feel alone. And no matter how much time you spend with people, no matter how intimate you get with your intimate partner, how much deep sex you have, how many experiences you share together, how close you get, in the end, you still feel alone. That's because the ultimate truth is that you are completely all alone, and that's something that you've been denying your whole life. That's something that is difficult to face. You need to face it at some point in your life. And it's not easy to face. It's emotionally difficult to face that you are all alone. You are so all alone that when you realize that you're all alone, you won't even be able to, like, call your mom and ask her, hey, am I all alone? Because you're so all alone and you're so conscious now that you realize that by picking up the phone and calling your mother, actually you're just asking yourself, am I all alone? And the only answer, of course, when you're conscious is that, yes, of course I'm all alone. So if I ask my mom, am I all alone? And she says, no, I have your back. I'm here. Don't worry, I'll support you. But that's me talking to myself because I am my mom. So I am all alone. And so that's that's hard to stomach for some people. But at the same time, if you do stomach it and transcend it, what you'll realize is that it's beautiful to be all alone. God is all alone. God is playing with itself. God is masturbating to itself all the time. Everything God does, everything that happens in the universe is just God's self-masturbation. That's all it is. If you're going to work, if you're having sex with somebody, if you're running a business, if you're hanging out with your friends, all of that is just, you can think of it in a very sort of abstract, high-level way as being God masturbating to itself, pretending to play all these different roles, to entertain itself, and to experience itself in its fullness. So part of God's fullness is that it can split itself and splinter itself into an infinite number of fragments, and then also it can reunite them through communion and through communication. So that's literally what's happening right now. See, we are in communion right now. I am God communicating to God. I am shooting this episode for myself. That's one way to look at it. Simultaneously, another way to look at it is that you are God communicating with yourself right now, creating and imagining me, and you created this episode to teach yourself these valuable insights about your own self, your own true nature. You see? And so right now we've fragmented ourselves. You've kind of created the fragment of you. I've created the fragment of me. And now, though, as we're becoming conscious of these fragments that we created, now we're unifying them together, and then we're transcending them, and we're realizing that now we're in communion. And we do that through communication. We do that through intimacy, through bonding, through sex, and so forth. See? So there you go. That answers that. The next duality is uniformity versus diversity. Often these are pitted against each other. In our politics today, you see a lot of people either pro-diversity or anti-diversity, and then they bicker back and forth with each other. What hardly anybody realizes is what the structure of reality is doing at all. What is sort of the purpose of this reality to be this way that it is? Well, if you transcend diversity and uniformity, ultimately you discover diversity with a capital D. So the genius of God's design of reality, of your own design. So don't hold God as something separate. You designed it this way. The reason you designed this reality this way is because you wanted to ensure maximum possible diversity, infinite diversity. So that's one way to think of reality, is just infinite diversity. So think of some design, think of a bunch of different designs that God could have used to create the world. And you might wonder, well, how would he choose which one to go with? And then what you discover is that he chose the one, you chose the one, which maximizes the diversity of everything. Maximum diversity. Because what you want to do as God is to fully experience every possibility of yourself. So every way you could be, you want to be, and you are. And that results in the multiplicity and diversity of the animal life on this planet and the human beings. Think about all the diversity in human beings that we have. People with different personalities, different quirks, different psychology, different genetics, different heights and different sexes and genders, and like all sorts of weird stuff. There's enormous diversity in humanity alone. But then you look at the animal kingdom, look at the diversity between cats and dogs and dinosaurs and beetles and insects and dragonflies and birds and bacteria and viruses. It's just a multiplicity. There's too many to count. There's billions of them, trillions of them. You couldn't classify them all. We're discovering new species still. Scientists are discovering new species every week. We're discovering new species. And we will be for centuries to come. Because new species are literally getting created every month and every year. There's not a fixed number of species on this planet. And that's just one planet out of billions of solar systems, out of billions of galaxies in one universe. And there's probably billions more universes beyond our own. So you see, it's infinite diversity. So to understand this is very important, because in order to love all of this diversity, you need to have a very big heart. Because part of the problem is that we get so identified with being one particular thing, like this particular human, or a black person, or a white person, or a Buddhist, or a Christian, or a nationalist, or a globalist, or whatever your identified with, we get so stuck on that we close our hearts down and we're not able to embrace all the infinite diversity that exists. And so the point of spirituality is to open your heart and your mind, and those go hand in hand. You can't do one really without the other. Open your heart and your mind, become so conscious that you embrace all of yourself and all of this beautiful diversity, and then you discover what true love is. True love is not just you being able to accept and tolerate diversity. It's literally you being, the physical being of you spread through all of the infinite life forms and creations of the universe. You being all that is synonymous with absolute love. So absolute love is equivalent to absolute diversity. And so it's not really possible to love fully without really appreciating the diversity of life and the diversity of humanity. And it's only by being able to appreciate this diversity that then you are at peace and you are able to let people be themselves without having to change them or criticize them or judge them, demonize them, or murder them, ultimately. See, most murders that happen by human beings happen because the person doing the murdering is not appreciating the full diversity of him or herself. Because if he did, then he would not need to murder anybody. See? Next on the list is the duality of dumb versus intelligent. These are often pitted against each other as opposites, with, of course, intelligence elevated on a pedestal, and being dumb is stigmatized and seen as being very negative and bad. And we strive to not be dumb, to not look dumb, to be more intelligent than we really are. Of course, intelligence is an absolute. I've talked about that in my episode called What is Intelligence? Go look at that. It's a pretty profound insight that you can realize. So intelligence with a capital I is an absolute. So you can become conscious that even all the quote-unquote dumb stuff in the world is actually there by an infinitely intelligent design. So, if you take some sort of dumb animal like a donkey, you might think, well, why did God create this dumb animal? But then you look at it from a higher elevation, higher perspective, and you realize that, yes, the donkey is dumb compared to, let's say, a human, but it's serving its function perfectly. And even those dumb human beings who are dumb relative to more intelligent human beings, they are serving their function perfectly in the whole. You got to understand this. You got to really zoom out and take the absolute perspective. And so there really isn't anything dumb in the universe. The universe is absolutely intelligent, infinitely intelligent. And this is hard for many people to understand. It sounds crazy because you attribute intelligence to just being something that your brain has. That's not what intelligence is. Intelligence is omnipresent, and it's a facet of the absolute. So intelligence is everywhere. In your body, in that rock, in that chair, in that tree, it's all intelligence. But when I talk about intelligence, that's a very different notion than IQ, being able to pass some test, or even being able to do some logical reasoning. These are very, very narrow notions of intelligence. Our science and our psychology departments and our psychology experts, they don't really fully understand the significance of what intelligence is. Because fundamentally they assume that the universe is dumb. They assume that matter is dumb. And therefore, they are not open enough to discover absolute intelligence. And the reason that it's possible for the universe to be intelligent is because it's a mind. It's not a dumb machine. It's not some molecules bouncing around in a box. It's a mind. It's consciousness. One of the characteristics of consciousness is intelligence. And consciousness, of course, is omnipresent. But we'll get to consciousness in a moment. Let's move on to the duality of freedom versus limitation. these are so often pitted against each other. Freedom, I'm for freedom, maximum freedom. But what you don't understand is that these are two sides of one coin. Especially the libertarian types and certain conservatives who love to tout themselves as champions of freedom. They have such a dualistic notion of freedom that it's silly. Here's the key thing that they don't understand. If you have maximum freedom, what that means is that you're free to do anything, which now that means that you can create limitations. So for example, if we create a government that allows total freedom, absolute freedom to every individual, you might think, well, that would be the ideal situation, right? Wrong, because what you're not understanding is how it's going to circle back around and work as such. If you give everybody in a society infinite freedom, then what's going to happen is that there's going to be a free-for-all battle because everyone's free to do whatever they want, so you're going to have just a clash of agendas. Everyone's going to be fighting everybody else because, hey, everyone's doing whatever they want. You know, like, I can come and take a shit on your front lawn. That's freedom. I could come and slit your throat in the middle of the night. That's freedom. I can be a terrorist. That's freedom. I can build a nuclear bomb and blow it up on your front lawn. That's freedom. That's what freedom means. Total freedom. So if you give every individual total freedom, certain of those individuals, the strongest ones, they will come out on top and they create all sorts of limitations. So for example, if you give everybody in this country total freedom, the most powerful people will use that freedom to enslave the rest of the people, thereby creating limitation upon everybody else, you see? And so what started out as freedom for everybody, sounds like a utopia, now has turned into a nightmare hell scenario where 99% of the population is enslaved. That's profound. Contemplate that one right there. That will fuck with your mind. But that's still just the tip of the iceberg of how deep this issue of freedom and limitation goes. So you can actually transcend freedom and limitation to realize freedom as an absolute, freedom with a capital F. This is the freedom of God. So what this means, and this is what God is, this is the very structure of God, is absolute freedom. It's infinite degrees of freedom. So that means that God is free to do absolutely anything with no restrictions whatsoever. God is not constrained by logical or physical laws, not constrained by time, by energy, by anything. There are no restrictions to God. It has literally absolute freedom. So therefore, because it's absolutely free, it, of course, now creates an infinite number of limitations. Because if you're totally free, that means that you're free to create limitation. Because if you exclude limitation from freedom, then you're not actually free. You see? If God couldn't limit itself, it wouldn't actually be free. So sometimes people ask, Leo, why would God put himself into a human body which is so limited? You know, as a human, I can't just like go flying through walls and using Jedi force powers to, you know, to force choke people and stuff like this. I can't lift physical objects with telepathy. I can't do all this stuff. Why am I so limited? If God is so unlimited, why don't I have these freedoms, these powers? You don't understand. It's actually precisely because God has infinite freedom that it also chooses to limit itself and to experience life from all the limited forms. So to be a human being is to be limited in certain specific ways. That's literally what makes a human being. Certain limitations. You have 2 hands, 2 feet, a mouth, a nose, you can speak, you can think. These are the limitations and also simultaneously abilities of a human. A human can't fly. We don't have wings. And you might say, well, wouldn't it be better if humans did have wings? Why didn't God create a human with wings? Because you see, the God is not interested in creating some ultra superhuman that has all capabilities. God is more interested in experiencing living through life from all the possible limitations that there are. Like God is interested in being a human, and then being a donkey, and then being a cat, and then being an ant, and then being a bacteria and experiencing life from all these different perspectives. God is interested in not just being strong, but also being weak, because God doesn't differentiate and put preference on being strong as being better than being weak. You see, to God, it's all the same. God is an embrace of everything. It doesn't discriminate, and it doesn't pick and choose based on your subjective criteria that you use as a human being. You see? So you might think that limitation is this terrible curse. And it sometimes does seem that way from the relative perspective. But ultimately, it's just literally what God is. God is infinite freedom, which of course entails infinite limitation. If you were absolutely free, can you see how you can't have a form? You actually can't have a physical form, because any physical form that you have will still be limited. Even if we take a human being and we give him horns and wings and 25 legs and arms and a brain that's 10 times bigger, even if you give him all that, he's still going to be very, very limited. There's still going to be a bunch of stuff he can't do, given his physiology, given his form. So to have absolute freedom, what that means is formlessness. So be careful what you wish for. If you want absolute freedom, what you're talking about is becoming completely formless, which is basically death. That's what you'll get when you die. You'll get infinite freedom. That's what you had before you were born. You were infinitely free. Then you, as God, you precipitated yourself and gave yourself limitations, which then, here's life. It arose. You get all these limitations. You're living in some particular country, on some particular planet, in some particular universe, within some particular dimension, during some particular era in history. And so you're experiencing a very small sliver of the entire infinite spectrum of possibility. And therefore you're limited. So appreciate your limitedness, because actually absolute freedom is quite terrifying when you experience it. It's quite terrifying. It's very empty. There's nothing there. It's going to feel like death to your ego. Next duality is part versus whole. People think of these as opposites. But actually, every part in reality is simultaneously also a whole. Which brings us to the notion of holons, which will require an entire separate episode to explain, but I'll touch on it here. So what a holon is, it's a thing which is both a part and a whole simultaneously. And this is everything in the universe is a holon. So for example, a carbon atom, you might think that's a part, but actually it's a whole, because a carbon atom contains parts. It contains protons, neutrons, electrons. You might say, well, but a proton, that's a whole. No, it's a part. I mean, it is a whole, but it contains parts. It's a holon, so it contains parts. You can break it apart even further, and so on. But as we move up the chain, for example, that carbon atom is present within some molecule, which is a whole, but also has parts, which is present within some protein. A protein is a holon, which is a whole, which is made up of a bunch of parts, like carbon atoms and other atoms. And then these proteins can make up an animal, like an ant, a creature. So a creature is a holon, or a whole, which is made out of parts, cells and molecules and proteins and so forth. And then ants, they make up an ant colony. An ant colony is a whole, which is made up of parts, different ants, and other things like the earth out of which the ants build their colony. And then that's all part of the larger unit called the rainforest, let's say, which is made of parts. You know, the rainforest is made up of trees and so forth and animals. And then that's part of something larger, the planet. And the planet is part of something larger, the solar system, part of something larger, the galaxy, part of something larger, the galaxy cluster, part of something larger, the entire universe, and so forth. See? So everything, point to anything. Take your finger right now, point to anything in the room, Anything you point to is going to be a whole on, or both a part and a whole. And ultimately, when you become fully conscious of non-duality, you're going to transcend the duality of part and whole, and you're going to realize wholeness with a capital W. Wholeness is an absolute, in which you become conscious that all there really is one universe, all of creation, the entire cosmos, and that, of course, includes any multiverses. All of it is just one unit, because there can't be any boundaries separating things. And this is when you discover, of course, that you are all alone. It's all alone. It exists by itself. There is no opposite. Reality, the universe, existence, God, you cannot have an opposite, because an opposite implies two, and in fact, there's only one. Which moves us on to the next duality, which is one versus many. You might wonder, Leo, how do you know that there's only one reality? What if there are more? That's because you're thinking dualistically. You have a duality that you're not conscious of yet, which is the duality between oneness and manyness. There is no difference between one and many. Everything can be subdivided an infinite number of times. Your mind is the one that's doing the subdivision and the one that's counting. So if you want, you could look at this hand as one object, one hand. But at the same time, you can also look at it as 5 fingers. At the same time, you can zoom in further and you can look at it as billions of cells. At the same time, you can zoom in on each cell and look at it further and say, well, this hand is actually trillions of molecules, and so forth. So what's the actual count here? Who says how many of anything there are here? You do. You do. So are there a trillion molecules here? Or is there one hand? Is there any difference between the two? You see, it's all the same. Oneness and manyness circles back around. It goes full circle. Such that what God is an infinite number of manynesses. So God is billions and trillions of atoms and molecules and cells and creatures and beings and humans and aliens and planets and galaxies and universes and realities, dimensions. It's all of them at once. So it's one and many simultaneously. And when you realize that, you transcend the duality of one versus many to oneness with a capital O. And that's when you realize your aloneness. Next is the duality of mundane versus divine. These two seem like opposites. When you start doing psychedelics, or you start experiencing some mystical experiences through yoga, through meditation, through concentration practice, through self-inquiry, common thing that happens with newbies is that they get this divine mystical experience. It's a mystical experience that happens. It usually lasts for only a few seconds or a few minutes when it first starts. It takes you by surprise, and it's amazing because you realize that everything in the room is divine. You realize your body is divine, the air is divine, everything is pure, radiant, self-illuminated, self-aware divinity. Whereas before, you just thought of it as some dumb physical universe. Now you realize the divinity of your own self and the physical world. But then you lose that experience, and you're back sort of in the mundane grind of life where you have to go take care of your kids, and you got to do your laundry and all this sorts of stuff. And it seems like, man, I just want to get back to that divine place where I'm in that mystical union. And so you might want to try some more psychedelics or some more yoga or whatever to get back there. But then as you keep doing more psychedelics, more yoga, and you become more and more conscious of the non-dual nature of everything, what you eventually realize is that the divine is not some magical realm that you escape to escape the grind of everyday life. Is that literally the mundane and the divine are one. And so you don't need to go anywhere to experience divinity. Divinity is right here, right now. Just become conscious of it. Become conscious of it. And so when you do that, that's sort of the fruition or the culmination of your spiritual path, is that you walk down the road and all you see is divinity. Everything you see is divine. It radiates with divinity, and you're conscious of it all the time. That's sort of your ultimate goal with the spiritual path. And that's divinity with a capital D. Divinity with a capital D. And so we have this very interesting split that happens between people who do spiritual practices and those who don't. Those who don't get stuck in the mundane grind of life, and they end up hating their life and being depressed and miserable. And then they curse God and say, God, how could God have created such a terrible, mundane existence? It's so dreary and boring and so lame and so terrible, full of misery and suffering. Why couldn't it be magical and radiant and divine? Why couldn't it be heavenly? Well, that's a pipe dream. Or so such people tell themselves. But then those who actually do the spiritual practices, and they do them a lot, eventually they break through, they discover divinity everywhere. And to them, they're walking around and they're looking at exactly the same stuff that the ordinary person is looking at, but they are conscious of the divinity of everything, whereas the ordinary, mundane person takes everything for granted. Even all the good stuff that he has in his life, he takes completely for granted and can't see the divinity of it. So he's constantly bitter and bitching and moaning about everything, criticizing and judging and hating. And that's a consequence of not having enough consciousness to see the divinity of it all. You can start, though, by maybe taking some mushrooms or some LSD and getting a little taste of divinity. Getting that little taste of divinity is your first real introduction into spirituality. When you realize that it's real and it's not just a theory or a belief or some wishful thinking, but that it's real. Next on the list is imminent versus transcendent. This is closely related to the one I just mentioned. So within Christianity, there's this debate that sometimes happens amongst theologians. Is God imminent or transcendent? And what that means is God in the world or is God beyond and outside the world? And of course, the answer is both. God is both simultaneously. You can't separate imminent and transcendent, nor can you separate mundane and divine. Because you can't separate subject and object. And you can't separate God from its creation. God is the creation. The way God creates is by being a chair, a couch, a dog, your annoying neighbor, or somebody you hate on television, your political opponent. That's how God creates. Next is holy versus unholy. A lot of Orthodox religious people get this wrong. They try to pursue holiness with a lowercase h. Holiness as opposite of unholiness. What they don't realize is that holy is actually an absolute. There is holy with a capital H, which means that you realize that everything is holy. You know, an Orthodox religious person is very careful to look out for sinful behavior. And so he's very careful not to, like go to a brothel. A priest doesn't want to go to a brothel. And if he goes to a brothel, then he's going to think that he's got to some unholy place. But of course, what is this brothel but a creation of God? And all those whores in the brothel, what are they but God? So the mistake the priest is making when he's going to the brothel is that he's not realizing that the brothel is holy. Holy with a capital H. And if he realized that, he could go to the brothel and enjoy himself, and actually he could convert, if he wanted to, some of those whores into religious seekers and help them awaken. But he can't do that because he himself is not truly awakened to the holiness of everything. It's not that God created some things which are holy and some things which are unholy. It's all holy. You just need to have the right vision to see it. It's a very common mistake of religious people. This, of course, leads to moralization. This leads to the whole divide between good versus evil. So it's very problematic. It also leads to a lot of death and war and genocide. Because once people get in their mind that something is holy with a lowercase h, as opposed to unholy, then, they wage a holy war against the unholy stuff. Muslims wage a holy war against Christians. Christians wage a holy war against Muslims. But both Christians and Muslims are creations of God. They're both holy with a capital H. They're both not realizing it. Some of them are, but many of them are not. Next, we have unconscious versus conscious. These are often pitted against each other. And you have to be very careful because, I use the word consciousness a lot and also unconsciousness a lot as I teach my material. And there's two ways in which I use those words. Sometimes when I say consciousness, I'm talking about consciousness with a lowercase c as opposite of unconsciousness. But also sometimes when I'm talking about consciousness, I'm talking about consciousness as an absolute. Consciousness with a capital C. This is a consciousness that has no opposite. So when you actually awaken, what you'll discover is that all of reality is one thing, consciousness. It's a field of infinite consciousness. That's what everything is. You are that field, and this field has no opposite, so there actually never was such a thing as unconsciousness. It's a total mindfuck. And so one of the problems, for example, within psychology, within therapy, especially because it stems from people like Sigmund Freud and other early psychologists who really didn't have non-dual awareness. So they created various kinds of dualities, one of the most dangerous of which is this duality between consciousness and unconsciousness. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as the unconscious mind, really. That's an abstraction. All there is consciousness. There's degrees of consciousness. Consciousness can do various things. Consciousness can pretend that it's unconscious. So what we call unconsciousness is actually consciousness being and acting as though it's unconscious. In the same way that you might have an actor playing dead on screen, that doesn't mean he's dead. He's playing dead. Tricky. Very, very tricky. Then we have the duality of knowing versus not knowing. These are often pitted against each other. Not knowing is demonized, and everyone tries to avoid admitting that they don't know. Everyone tries to be in a position of knowing. But actually, not knowing is a more powerful position, in a certain sense, than knowing. And they're deeply, intimately related. In order to know something, you first have to not know it. Or maybe you don't. So you can transcend knowing versus not knowing to realize, and we could label this in different ways. You could realize knowing with a capital K, or you could realize not knowing with a capital N, or you could realize mystery with a capital M. What you realize is that actually it's not possible to know anything, precisely because you're being everything. So there's a sort of a collapse of the duality between epistemology and metaphysics, like I said before. And so what you realize is that literally you don't know what anything is. So in a sense, when you awaken, you become totally conscious. But at the same time, as you have infinite, omniscient, godlike consciousness, you don't know anything. Because knowing is a conceptual thing, and being is prior to knowing. And so what you're left with is this irreducible mystery, mystery with a capital M. Mystery is an irreducible aspect of reality. You cannot demystify reality, and if you try, you're going to be deluded, which is one of the mistakes that rationalists and materialists make, is they try to demystify reality through reason, logic, and science, and that cannot work. It's always partial, and it's always untenable. There's always more mystery, and even the stuff that you think you've unraveled the mystery of, you actually haven't. All you've done is you've tricked yourself into thinking that you know something that you actually don't know. It's quite a mindfuck, especially if you're really attached to knowledge, especially if you're an academic, scientist, intellectual, philosopher, theologian. Yeah, you've got a real big problem with knowing. and not knowing. You've created a duality out of these two. Next on the list is meaningless versus meaningful. These seem like opposites. People want to have a meaningful life. People are pursuing meaning. But what they don't realize is that they create meaning. So ultimately, what you can become conscious of is that everything as an absolute is meaningless. Meaningless with a capital M. But the trick with it is that it goes full circle. So when you realize meaninglessness, most people think like, oh no, Leo, but if everything is meaningless, that's terrible. That's awful. That sounds like nihilism. That sounds like depression. It sounds like suicide. It sounds like that's going to destroy civilization. No, you don't realize yet how total and absolute meaninglessness is. Meaningless is so absolute and total that your judgment of meaninglessness as being bad is itself a meaning that you're creating. So you're not actually there yet. You're not at absolute meaninglessness. You're imagining what it is, but you haven't actually become conscious of it. When you totally become conscious of absolute meaninglessness, what you discover is that it goes full circle, and it's the most meaningful discovery you could possibly make. That's the twisted irony of it. There is nothing more meaningful than to discover that the entire universe is totally meaningless. And when you realize this, then you realize that you have infinite freedom to create whatever kind of meanings you want, because you realize that all meanings are fabrications. So you can still participate in the creation of meaning, but now you can do it consciously. You can create your own life purpose, whichever kind you want, whatever you find meaningful, you can still pursue, but this time you're doing it consciously, rather than expecting society or some sort of external authority figure to tell you what is or isn't meaningful. And also what you realize is that being is way more meaningful than meaning. This is one of the paradoxes of awakening, is that you lose all meaning, but at the same time you can say in a metaphorical, figurative sense that actually for the very first time your life now suddenly feels meaningful. Spirituality is so meaningful precisely because it's totally meaningless. And this is what a lot of religious people don't understand. Religious people are busy chasing meaning and purpose in their life. And this actually, paradoxically, is the chief obstacle to them discovering meaninglessness and to surrendering to it, and therefore discovering God. So if you want to discover God, destroy all meaning, and all that will be left is God. Pure God is the Godhead. But how many religious people want to do that? They don't. They're in denial about it. Because really, it's the ego that creates meaning. The devil creates meaning, not the Godhead. The Godhead just is. It doesn't need meaning. The ego needs meaning as a function of survival. I think I've discussed that elsewhere. I have some older episodes about meaning and purpose. Go check those out. Next on the list is life versus death. Oh boy, this is a big one. People hold these as opposites, but of course you should know from the Lion King, from the circle of life, how life and death are intimately connected, and you can't have one without the other. And also, well, let me explain that one a little more, because some people might not even get that. What do I mean by this? Well, look, I mean, for you to live, you need to kill. A lot of vegans and vegetarians are in denial about this. But you're a killing machine. You're killing all the time. Even if you're eating plants, you're killing all the time. A human being cannot live. No organism can be alive without creating death. No matter how careful you are, no matter how compassionate and loving you are, no matter how socially responsible you are, no matter what you eat, you're going to have to kill to live. Even if it's just as a result of walking down the street to pick up your groceries. Let's say that in the future, some company invents some sort of like chemical formula that you can just kind of sip out of a straw, and you can replace all your food with this. There are some companies that are already doing this. Let's say a company does do this. You might say, well, Leo, if somebody sips this chemical out of this straw for his whole life, then he's not going to kill anybody. And that contradicts what you just said. So we can solve this problem with science and technology, is what I'm telling you. And what I'm telling you is, no, you can't. Because, see, when you get in your car to drive to pick up your sippy cup of chemicals, you are going to drive over ants. You are going to slam into butterflies and dragonflies and fruit flies and other moths and other creatures as you're driving on your way to pick up your chemical. See? So to be alive, you have to kill, kill by the thousands and by the millions. So every human being who has ever lived is responsible for the death of tens of thousands, if not millions, of creatures and life forms. Even if you put yourself into a bubble and you never drive a car and you try to completely isolate yourself and be totally harmless to the world, even for you to live, the bacteria that is present by the millions within you that will kill you if you don't kill it first, is this battle of life versus death is constantly being waged inside your body, inside your sinuses, in your stomach. You have viruses that your body is fighting off all the time. Funguses and so forth. So you can't be alive without killing millions of things. This is just a fact of life. And it must be this way because of the non-dual nature of life. And then, of course, you can transcend the duality of life versus death to discover life with a capital F, or life with a capital L. And what that means is a couple of things. First of all, you discover that death is just an idea. It's a concept. There's no such thing as death. And of course, this is when you awaken, you will discover immortality this way. There's only life. Also, what you'll discover is that, contrary to what materialist science tells us, life is not limited to biological entities. Life is not a property of creatures. Life is omnipresent. The entire universe is alive. So there's no distinction between life and death, or living and non-living, which sort of helps you to resolve that sticky problem within science about what is the origin of life. Well, of course, there was no clear line that molecules crossed to go from non-living molecules to living molecules. There was no such a line. It was just, they got more and more complex until eventually we started calling them alive, but they were alive from the very beginning. That's life with a capital L. Sounds crazy, I know, but you got to awaken to understand it. Mortal and immortal are pitted as opposites. Of course, you can transcend this duality to realize immortality with a capital I. Immortality is when you realize that reality has no opposite and that you are all of reality. So, of course, you're immortal and you can't die. You've been alive forever, and you will be alive forever. Your true nature cannot die. And that is ultimately how you gain liberation and freedom from suffering, is by realizing your own immortality. You realize that you are the entire universe, who just happens right now to be living through a human form, but you're going to live through all forms, so it's no big deal. There's an infinite number of forms you'll live through. And even if you become formless, it still doesn't matter, because your true nature is formless. Then, of course, that brings us to the very big one, the big duality of real versus unreal. These seem like opposites, but actually you can transcend these to discover reality with a capital R, which is reality that has no opposite. So the truth is that there is nothing unreal. Everything that is real. Now you might say, oh, well, what about Santa Claus? Santa Claus is unreal. No, Santa Claus is real. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in your experience right now. It's just that you have to be very clear about what Santa Claus is. So Santa Claus is real, but it's real as something in your mind, something you're imagining, or some bearded man, sitting in a mall wearing a costume. That's Santa Claus. That's what Santa Claus is. Now that's real, but of course, the problem is that your mind imagines that what Santa Claus really means is it means some actual mythical figure who lives in the North Pole and actually delivers presents to people. No, that's a myth. So a myth is real in the sense that it's a myth. So the only problem is that you're getting lost in concepts. That's the only problem. So unreal only exists as a concept. You see? And of course, we should broaden this out. This category of real and unreal, it can be talked about in different labels. So you could have a duality of reality versus fantasy, or reality versus imagination, or reality versus dreams, or reality versus hallucination, or even reality versus a video game, or reality versus fiction. So all of this is part of the duality that I'm calling real versus unreal. So in our culture and within science and within philosophy even, and even within religion, we make a distinction between real and unreal stuff, fantasy and reality, dreams and waking life. But actually there is no such duality. You can transcend this. Which is why I call reality a hallucination, which is why gurus call reality just a dream. It is, because you can't distinguish the two. So right now I'm sitting here and I'm hallucinating a body, and I'm hallucinating that I'm talking to you, and you're sitting over there hallucinating, listening to me. That's what's happening. You've hallucinated your entire life. You're hallucinating that you were born. Ta-da! The word hallucination is a beautiful word. I love this word because the technical definition of a hallucination is an appearance without any substance to it. And so that's exactly what's happening. So this body is an appearance with no substance behind it. All we have are appearances, which is the same thing as saying reality is identical to hallucination. When you become really conscious, you can play a video game like Super Mario, or maybe a more sophisticated one. What's popular today? These 3D video games, Legend of Zelda, where you're running around in this beautiful 3D open world now and all this, right? Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, whatever you like. These open world RPGs are really popular these days. And you're in it and you're playing it and you're loving it and it's, this beautiful immersive world. And in video games, what are we talking about? Immersion, a huge selling point of video games is immersion. And of course, that's why we need photorealistic graphics and all this sort of stuff and VR goggles. And you're so immersed in this new VR simulation to the point where what? You start to lose yourself to it and you can't distinguish it from reality anymore. People think, well, that's just because the graphics are getting so good. No, you don't understand. It's much more profound than that. Literally, there is no difference between this physical reality here and the one in your video game. It's the exact same reality. But you have to be conscious enough to realize that that is a video game. What a video game means is pixels. But those pixels are still real. All the characters are still real. Mario is a real thing. It's just not like a human. All right? So don't confuse it that way. But literally, you can't tell a video game from reality. In fact, in the future, what this means is that we'll actually be able to create video games which are so sophisticated and complex and self-involved that the characters in the video games will not be able to know whether they're inside of a video game or inside of reality. How's that for a mindfuck? So you see Mario, when Mario is running around the screen, in a certain sense, you might say that he doesn't know that what he's doing isn't reality. To him, it seems real. Of course, Mario is not sophisticated enough to have this sort of reasoning or cognition. But in the future, you could actually imagine a sort of a supercomputer, which actually gives Mario a sort of cognition to the point where Mario actually starts to believe that Mario World and his own body are actually real and not a video game. And the reason that will be able to happen is because there is no distinction between reality and a video game. So in a certain sense, he won't be wrong. But in another sense, he will be deluded in the same way that you're deluded in that you think that you're real, when actually you're not. So that will be really interesting. I look forward to the days when we have video games where our video game protagonists will be able to awaken to the fact that they're inside of a video game. And I want to see some screen captures of the look on their face when Mario awakens to the fact that actually he's God. That'll be awesome. But it might take a while to get there. Not in our lifetime. So don't hold your breath. The next duality is being versus non-being. These seem like opposites. Actually, what you can discover is that being is an absolute. Being with a capital B. There is nothing but being. Everything that's happening right now is being. Everything that's ever happened in your life is being. Even all falsehood and delusion and what you might call hallucination is still being. Untruth is still being. You can't speak an untruth without it being. To make a lie, it has to be. Ta-da. But this is being with a capital B. It's an absolute. You can, let's move on to the next item here. The next duality, actual versus potential, or actual versus virtual. These seem like opposites, but actually they're not. You can transcend actual versus potential to discover that you have actual with a capital A. Everything is actual. Everything potential becomes actual. And everything actual, in a sense, was potential. And what God is just infinite potential, which, of course, is indistinct from infinite actualization. So everything that God could be, God becomes. And in a certain sense, because there is no difference between actual and potential, here we are. If you want a real mindfuck, imagine this. Imagine that, see, you're sitting here right now and you're thinking that, well, okay, this is actual. My body is actual. This room is actual. But flip that around and try to think of it and try to see it as this room is potential. It's not actual. Your body is potential. Now you might say, but Leo, no, it's not potential. It's actually here. But how would you know the difference between actual and potential? Really think about that. Don't be so quick to say that I can easily tell them apart. You can't tell them apart. Actual and potential are identical. This is all potential. Everything that's ever happening is potential. In a certain sense, you might say that none of it exists really, or it exists as potential, which is the same thing as saying that it's actual. Same thing for the duality between actual and conceptual. These might seem separate and different, but all concepts are actual. You can't have a concept that's not actual. Even a concept of like energy. Yes, energy is conceptual, but at the same time, that concept is actual. Next, we have the duality of self versus other, or self versus world. I've already touched on this, but there's a lot that could be said about this because this is perhaps one of the most fundamental dualities that you hold. It's the duality that is responsible for running your entire life. Is the distinction you make between yourself and everything else. In fact, this distinction is how you were born. You were not born biologically or physically. You were born the moment that a distinction between you and not you occurred. And see, I said in the past, I think I said in the last part 2 of this series, that what a duality is, it's a division within consciousness. So when we make a division, like if we cut an apple in half, simultaneously we're creating 2 parts. That's what a division is. A division always creates 2 parts. Now, of course, you can have multiple divisions creating more than 2 parts, but each division is making 2 parts. So the very first division that you made to come into existence is the division between me and not me. Me and world. Me and another person. The only way that you exist as a self, as an ego that you imagine yourself to be, is because you tell yourself that you're that and not the rest of the world. If you told yourself that you were the rest of the world and that would remove the division between world and self, literally you would become the whole world. You see? But you can't even fathom what I'm saying right now in your present state of consciousness, unless maybe you're already enlightened, because you are so certain that you're real. You're so certain that you're actual. You're so certain that the division between self and other and self and world is actually real. But you have to realize, like we said earlier, that the duality between actual and real is itself untenable and must collapse. So when you realize this, you'll die. See, when you realize that there's no difference between self and the world, you'll die. Which is precisely why you're going to do everything in your power not to realize it. So even though I'm telling you all this and you're understanding it intellectually, you're not actually going to realize it. Because if you realized it, you'd be dead. And then you'd be awake. And then you'd be immortal. And then you'd be God. And then you'd be absolute. And then you'd be infinite. But of course, your entire life is predicated upon you not being that. Your whole life is devoted to you being finite and limited and your particular self. That's all that you've been doing in your whole life. So are you going to give that up simply because you watched one of my videos? Of course not. You're terrified of doing what I'm telling you to do. It is totally terrifying because you think it's going to destroy your entire life because you think that death is actually real. You see how this duality works? Your entire sense of reality and self and life is completely corrupted by these dualistic divisions that you've made. And that's as it should be, because if you didn't have those, you couldn't be alive. So as it should be. But also realize that it's possible to transcend that if you want. That's what awakening is about. So yeah, this is very, very tricky stuff. I mean, like this is some of the most advanced and subtle things that could ever be communicated to a human being, from one human being to another. I'm making it sound kind of easy. I'm being kind of flippant. I'm going through it kind of fast, and I'm kind of smiling through it because, once you get on the other side of it and you understand it and you have a lot of familiarity with it, like I have at this point, then, it becomes totally normal to you, and there's nothing weird about it, nothing crazy about it. But when you're first hearing it for the first time, or even for the 100th time before you've actually done any practices or had any direct experiences of it, it sounds like lunacy, and it sounds dangerous and crazy, and yeah, people don't realize how radical this work is, and how radical awakening is, and how radical non-duality is. People think that, non-duality is just some interesting theory I listened to on YouTube. No, non-duality is it's the end of your life. It's the end of your life. It's the end of the world. It's the end of reality. As you realize that all those things were conceptual the entire time. All right, let's take a quick intermission right here. I got to catch my breath, and we'll be back to wrap it all up. The next duality on our list is one that we've already kind of spoiled by talking about it so much, which is the duality between self and God. So, of course, because the duality between self and other and self and world is untenable and must collapse, also the duality between God and world must collapse. And so you can see how if God is the world and you are the world, then you are God. And this is something I've talked about quite a lot, so I don't want to elaborate it on much more here. But of course, the thing you have to understand about God is that there's sort of two versions of God. there's God with a lowercase g, and there's God with an uppercase g. God is an absolute. God is the absolute. Most religious people, or most people ever who talk about God with a lowercase g, not the actual God, but some idea of God, some image of God, or some story that they have about God, or a belief in God, but not the actual thing. And they don't know that there is an actual thing because they've replaced it with a belief. But in fact, you can transcend the duality between self and God to realize that self is God. Self with a capital S, the self, is God. Which leads us to the next duality of selfish versus selfless. This can be transcended to selfless with a capital S, or the self with a capital S. The self with a capital S is the same thing as selflessness with a capital S. So usually people think of these things as opposite, but what you discover when you become totally selfless, free of ego, is that what remains is emptiness or nothingness or absolute subjectivity. And that absolute subjectivity is the non-self self. It's the self which is prior to the human, biographical, biological, physical self that you conventionally think that you are. So if you surrender that identity to your physical and psychological being, if you surrender that, then what you discover is that you're the entire universe, and the entire universe is that self, and it's totally selfless. So God is totally selfless, and this is where love comes from. Absolute love with the capital L is that absolute love with the capital L is just total, absolute selflessness. And of course, by being absolutely selfless, you become all the individual selves that populate the Earth and all the other planets and universes that are out there. The next duality is meditation versus life. When we start meditating, we have this duality. It's like when I'm meditating for 30 minutes a day or 60 minutes a day, that's my meditation practice. I'm sitting on the cushion, I'm putting a lot of effort into it, I'm concentrating, meditating, and good, okay. But then when my timer rings and I'm not on the cushion anymore, now I'm back to ordinary life. And it's like the opposite of meditation. But then, of course, as you practice meditation more and more and more, ultimately you get to a point, especially after a few awakenings, where your entire life becomes one seamless, constant meditation. And then you live that way. And that's what mindfulness practice is. You're trying to be mindful all the time, not just during some formal sit or during some formal retreat. So it's okay if right now for you meditation is just this limited, confined thing that you do formally, but just realize that over the years and decades, it will start to spill over into everyday life such that you can't distinguish them anymore. And in fact, you're going to stop using any formal techniques after a certain point, and all that meditation will mean for you is just sitting and being, or not even sitting, just being, no matter what you're doing. You could be walking, talking, eating, looking at a TV, doing your work, and sort of in the background, you'll be meditating. That's when you get really good. The next duality is existence versus non-existence. This is a tricky one that confuses a lot of people, a lot of cosmologists and astrophysicists and scientists and PhDs. They don't understand. They don't understand that existence and non-existence is a duality. So actually, you can transcend these two to discover that what there is truly is existence with a capital E as an absolute. So existence actually has no opposite. Conventionally, it seems to us that there is an opposite to non-existence. You might say, well, Leah, what are you talking about? Like, Santa Claus doesn't exist. So isn't that evidence of non-existence? No, actually it's not, because Santa Claus exists as Santa Claus. as that fictional character. That's what it is. That's not non-existence, that's existence. A unicorn exists as that magical, mystical animal. Whether you're imagining it or you draw on a piece of paper, that's what a unicorn is. That's existence. Now you might say, Leo, but the real unicorn, it doesn't exist. But that too exists. Your image of a real unicorn or a real Santa Claus, that exists. It's just not what you think it is. So you're getting lost in concepts. And so what you need to realize ultimately by transcending this duality is that there is no opposite to existence. If something is, even if it's a falsehood or a delusion, it still exists. You just need to not be deluded by it and to understand what it is accurately. This trips a lot of people up. And so the reason that you're able to attain immortality through awakening is because you realize that with total non-duality, by the transcending of all these divisions that your own mind created, you're able to realize that actually there is just existence as an absolute with no opposite. And so therefore you literally cannot die or go anywhere because it's just existence forever. It's eternal existence as an absolute. And of course, that's why God can't be destroyed, because God just is existence. Existence can't go anywhere because it just exists. When I talk about existence, I'm talking about existence in its pure form, existence without any content. So a lot of people confuse the content of existence for existence itself, but actually these are two distinct things. There is existence, which is independent of all form. Forms can exist within it, or it can just be empty existence with no form. Now, most people call that non-existence, but actually it's still existence. It's just empty of form. So that's what trips people up. Next duality is truth versus falsehood. Seems like totally opposite, right? But no, they're deeply related. In fact, you can transcend these two to realize truth with a capital T, of course, absolute truth, which is identical with God, identical with love, identical with selflessness, identical with everything. So what truth is just absolutely everything that is. And when you become conscious of what truth is, you'll realize that falsehood doesn't exist and never has existed, because falsehood isn't true. In a sense, to tell a falsehood, it still has to happen within the domain of truth or within the domain of existence, as I've talked about before. So really, there is no such thing as falsehood. There's only pure truth. Pure truth is consciousness or awareness, and there is nothing opposite of truth as an absolute. This is a real mindfuck that a lot of people just don't understand, because you're not able to understand this using rationality or conventional thinking. You need to become deeply awoken to realize this. The next duality is a really important one, which is the duality between duality and non-duality. This is really tricky, because you probably have been wondering, Leo, well, you talk about non-duality, but isn't that you creating a duality between duality and non-duality? And my answer, my answer, of course, is yes. Of course. You need to understand that this is inescapable when I am communicating. This is inescapable because, like I told you at the very beginning of this series, all human communication and thought is dualistic, which does not exclude my own communication and thought. So I'm not being a hypocrite here. I'm acknowledging that all of my own communication is dualistic. Even when I'm talking about non-duality, my communication to you is still dualistic, and that can't be avoided. So actually, there's two versions of non-duality. So this is going to get even trickier now. Try to stay with me. there's two versions of non-duality. There's non-duality with the lowercase n and non-duality with an uppercase n as an absolute. So actual, absolute non-duality, the thing that I'm pointing to, but the thing that I cannot say and no human being will ever be able to say no matter how much they speak or write or think. That non-duality with a capital N that I'm pointing to, that thing is the whole purpose of this communication. And yet that thing will never be part of this communication in a certain sense. You see, it cannot be communicated to you because if it could, you would become awoke. And you can't become awoke until you're awoke. So the problem here is that you need to transcend language, thought, and symbols. And so, on the one hand, we need to transcend language, thought, and symbols, but on the other hand, we have to use something to communicate. It has to be language, thought, or symbols. So you need to be conscious enough to realize that when I'm talking about non-duality and you're thinking about non-duality, that is still duality. You still haven't really grasped what is being pointed to. That transcendental absolute cannot be put into words. So that's okay. That's not a problem per se. You just need to be very, very mindful of that, and you need to do practices, and you need to grasp that true, ultimate, absolute non-duality with a capital N for yourself. See? And also you need to be careful that as you're practicing non-duality, you don't turn non-duality into a theory, into an ideology, into a philosophy, or into a doctrine that you cling to, which is opposed to duality. So newbies who spend a few years studying non-duality and practicing it, they commonly fall into this trap of pursuing non-duality with a lowercase n, which means that they are like striving to be super non-dual, but at the same time as they're doing that, they're also demonizing and judging and criticizing and trying to move away from duality, as though duality is bad, wrong, deluded, false, and so forth, and somehow separate from God. But of course, what you need to realize is that even duality is part of God. Even though it's not absolutely true, it's still relatively true and part of all of creation. In the same way that delusion and illusion are part of the creation. So this becomes a problem because if you demonize delusion, illusion, and duality, you're going to still be stuck in self-hatred, and you're not going to do a full embrace of everything. You're not going to really transcend. It's the same thing as chasing holiness with the lowercase h or chasing goodness with the lowercase g. You're not transcending the two and embracing everything, and that becomes a very big problem. So this is a very important point if you want to get to the highest levels. Now you might wonder, well, but Leo, I'm confused now. It sounds that sometimes it sounds as though you're saying that reality is, of course, non-dual. And then at other times, it sounds like you're saying that reality is dualistic. So what are you really saying here? That's right. I have some videos where I stress and say that reality is non-dual. I have other videos where I talk about the dialectical nature of reality and how the world of form always has these polar opposites that are in tension with each other. So which one is it? It's both. You see, you can't distinguish them really. You can't separate them. It's both. Look at the yin-yang symbol again. Look at how it is. You've got the white, you've got the black, you've got a dot of white in the black, you've got a dot of black in the white, and you've got the entire thing all coming together seamlessly. The absolute. So it's very useful to be able to have like these lenses that you can put on and off as you're looking at the world. You need to have a lens where you're able to look at the world dualistically and to appreciate and to study deeply the polar opposites and how they interplay with each other and the various kinds of distinctions and categories that we can create. So this is the realm of the relative. You can't just dismiss that. And then at the same time, you need to have another lens, which is the non-dual lens that you can put on, and you can look at all dualities and all distinctions and all categories and see it as all just part of oneness. The next duality that we're brought to here is relative versus absolute. And this is also very tricky. We say that there's a relative truth, there's an absolute truth. Which one is ultimate? Well, of course, the ultimate is the absolute with a capital A. When you are in absolute consciousness, it has no opposite, and you're in total consciousness, you might say. And so that is like the ultimate truth. And it's, in fact, such an ultimate truth that you even completely forget there was a relative truth. It's so absolute, it eclipses relativity. But when you're sort of functioning in everyday life, using conventional language within human society and culture, dealing with science and politics and religion and sociology and your family and business and all this stuff, this is the realm of the relative. And so, again, you need to have sort of two lenses that you can use to look at the world in a relative way and in an absolute way, and not try to exclude one or the other. So a mistake that people make is that they become conscious of the absolute, and then what they do is they think, oh, well, only the absolute is true and the relative world is all false, and it's all illusion, and I want to stay far away from it. But if you do that, you've created a new division. See, now you're dividing relative from the absolute. True absolute, the true embodiment of the absolute is that yes, you're fully conscious of the absolute, but at the same time, you also embrace all the relative stuff. So that's a very sophisticated and sort of a nuanced approach to this. Also understand that there is the absolute with a lowercase a and an absolute with the uppercase A. The absolute with an uppercase A cannot be communicated to you. You need to have a mystical experience of that. Whereas the absolute with a lowercase a is what I'm talking about whenever I'm talking, and what you're thinking whenever you're thinking about the absolute. So you can't actually think about the absolute with an uppercase a. Whenever you're thinking about the absolute, that's a lowercase a. It's tricky, it's a little confusing. Contemplate that. The next duality is division versus unity. Some people are focused on dividing the world. Some people are focused on unifying the world. The problem, though, is that most people who try to unify the world are doing it in a lowercase u sort of way. You can transcend this duality to unity with an uppercase u, which means it's a unity that embraces division, not divides itself from division. You see the hypocrisy and contradiction of trying to unify people, but then excluding those who want division. See, those who want division, most unifiers will try to exclude those people from their unity party. So it will be like the unity party against some other party. And this is all happening within the relative domain. This is not yet unity with an uppercase U. Unity with an uppercase U realizes that we unify by also accepting that there will be division. And that's okay. And in fact, that's absolutely necessary, and reality cannot be otherwise. Another duality is sane versus insane. People think that, oh, well, that person is crazy, that person has insane beliefs and ideas. They're not normal and rational like me. But how do you determine what is sane and what is not sane? If you understand what I'm teaching you here, then you should realize that that boundary between the two is not going to be sharp. if you investigate it deeper and deeper, you're going to realize that the two actually bleed together, and there's no way to really distinguish them. Who gets to say what is sane or what is insane? You do? So if you say that some belief is sane, how do you know that you're not insane and just saying that from your insanity? You don't, and you can't. And that's the nature of reality, is that you can't distinguish sanity from insanity. The things that we call sane are really just convention. You believe it's sane because it's practical for your survival, it works for whatever you need it to do, and other people around you generally agree and don't call you insane for it. That's really what we mean when we say something is sane. And of course, as you see by studying different cultures during different eras and studying different peoples and different religious movements and scientific intellectual developments and philosophical debates, you see that people have been calling other people insane since the dawn of time. You know, there are many scientists who think other scientists are insane. So there's no safety here. Don't think that by being a scientist or by being a rationalist or by being a mathematician or by being anything, that somehow you're going to save yourself from the possibility of insanity. You won't. All you're doing is you're surrounding yourself with social conventions. That's all it is. That's all it is. So in fact, by trying to create the distinction between sanity and insanity, actually you're behaving in an insane manner because you're making that up. And yet now you're confusing your own mental fabrications with ultimate reality or with truth. And that's just not the case. And so the reason that a lot of people struggle with psychedelics is they take some LSD, some mushrooms, some DMT, or whatever else. And one of the things these psychedelics can reveal to you, which is very threatening and scary and shocking, is they can blur the line between sanity and insanity where you can't tell the two apart anymore. And this freaks a lot of people out. In fact, this is one of the most freakiest kind of trips you can have, is where you go down this sort of insane rabbit hole where literally you start to have thoughts and ideas which become so indistinguishable from physical reality that you literally can't tell whether you're sane or insane anymore. And this is very, very scary because in the moment when you're in this trip, it can feel like you're stuck in this sort of insane thought spiral that never ends forever. And during that time, it's scary, it's freaky, and all you want is just to get back to a sane place. But at the same time, you realize there is no sane place to get back to, which only makes you feel even worse. And so you just go down this infinite rabbit hole of insanity until the trip wears off, and then you're kind of back to normal, and then you recollect yourself. But man, that can be a very bad trip. So I've had some of those, as you could probably tell. And on the one hand, it's bad. On the other hand, it's actually great because it's important for you to face this truth. And most people just have never faced this truth. It's a very shocking truth with very serious ramifications. It undermines all of science, all of philosophy, all of culture, everything you believe. It undermines. It's crazy, but at the same time, it's true. This is what we mean by mindfuckery. This is the definition of mindfuckery right here. And so see, a lot of people who do psychedelics, they don't have any kind of theoretical foundation. They haven't heard these sorts of clear lectures like I'm giving to you, explaining all this stuff in all this excruciating detail. They haven't studied any of this. So they just pop some mushrooms or LSD at a party somewhere in a terrible setting, at a rave or something, loud music blaring, and then they have these crazy insights like sanity versus insanity can't be distinguished, and then that totally freaks them out, and then they blame the psychedelic for it, as if the psychedelic did something wrong. No, all the psychedelic did was show you the truth. But of course, as Terence McKenna says, it's not enough just to discover the truth. The real trick is facing the truth. Can you stomach the truth? The truth is a very radical thing. Also, these trips give you a real profound compassion and empathy for people who have mental instabilities, who suffer from quote unquote insanity, who are in insane asylums, who have these sorts of neurological brain disorders that doesn't make their mind function quite normally, you empathize with them. Like that's a very terrible way to live if you're stuck in that and you can't break free of it. Imagine that your whole life is just one bad trip where you can't distinguish reality from fiction and you're confusing the two all the time. And your mind is taking down these insane vortexes that you can't break out of. Yeah, that's a very hellish existence. The next duality is matter versus spirit. People tend to hold these as opposites. A lot of times people hear me talking about spirituality and instantly they recoil and they say, oh, well, spirituality, that's all fluffy bullshit stuff. Matter is what's real. Without realizing that true spirit is the transcendence of the distinction between matter and spirit. And so when you transcend the two, you get spirit with a capital S. Everything is spirit. Atoms and molecules and trees and cars and minds, human beings, all of it is spirit. This is spirit right here, right now. You can be conscious of it, or you cannot. If you're a materialist, then you're not conscious of it. And so to you, it seems like spirit is absurd, impossible, hocus pocus, superstition, wishful thinking. Where really you're just not conscious of the obvious because you haven't done the spiritual practices. And you also haven't questioned and deconstructed your materialist paradigm. You know, one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century with quantum mechanics was the discovery that there is no such thing as matter. Matter doesn't exist. Science itself has debunked the notion of matter. Einstein showed that matter and energy are interchangeable, so there's no distinction between matter and energy. But even beyond that, when you look with quantum mechanics into what is matter, what is an atom, you discover that there is no particle there. There's no such thing as discrete particles. All particles in the entire universe are all entangled into one quantum field. It's an infinite quantum field. And quantum physicists use quantum field equations to talk about these fields. Well, this field that they're talking about is just consciousness or spirit. It's one field. They just don't realize what they're really studying yet. Of course, some of them do, but many of them don't. Next, we have the duality of form versus formless. These seem like opposites, but actually you transcend these two when you get really, really awoke and you realize that form and formlessness are actually identical. So the transcendence of form and formlessness really has no name. You could call it form with a capital F, or you could call it formlessness with a capital F, but really the two are just literally identical. That's probably one of the highest and deepest forms of awakening. When you have moderate forms of awakening, you still have a semblance of a duality between form and formlessness, and you tend to prefer one over the other. A lot of people, when they start to awaken, they start to identify with formlessness, and they start to exclude or denounce form as though form is somehow bad or unnecessary or separate from them. But then, if they have deeper awakenings, they realize, oh, no, wait a minute, that was a mistake because I'm still creating a subtle duality between form and formlessness. Actually, they're literally identical, so I can't denounce or criticize form. I can't move away from form. I can't escape form. Form is formlessness, so there's nowhere to escape. There's also a duality between Shiva and Shakhty. This is similar to form and formlessness. Shiva is another way to say formlessness, and Shakhty is energy or form. And so in the Hindu and various yogic traditions, there's this mythology that they have about how Shiva is at play with Shakhty, and the two are coming together. Shiva is supposed to be the masculine, Shakhty is supposed to be the feminine, and they're interplaying with each other. And so that's a beautiful little metaphor that you can use. So everything that's happening around me right now, including my body and the sounds that I'm making, this is all the Shakhty. And all of it is occurring within emptiness, which is Shiva. But at the same time, Shiva and Shakhty are actually identical because form and formlessness are actually identical. So while all of this form is going on, this is actually all completely formless. But you got to become conscious of that. It's not enough to just talk about it. Another duality is something versus nothing. People hold these as opposites. Actually, they're the same. It's impossible to distinguish something from nothing. When you transcend that, you realize nothingness with a capital N. Nothingness with a capital N is not separate from somethingness, but actually identical to somethingness. It's an absolute. And this is what you awaken to with enlightenment. And of course, nothing is identical to everything. That's another duality here that trips people up. Nothing and everything are one. And also there's the duality of zero versus infinity. These are held as opposites when actually they're identical. Zero is infinity. Infinity is zero. How can this be? Because when something is infinite, it's completely boundless and therefore formless and therefore nothing. Because everything within it cancels out. Sort of like all the positive numbers cancel out all the negative numbers, and you just end up with zero. And zero is also unbounded. It stretches out forever, everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's everywhere and it's nowhere, and that's exactly infinity. There's also a duality created between the finite and the infinite. So here you got to be careful again, and you got to distinguish between infinite with a lowercase I and infinite with an uppercase I. So infinite as an absolute is uppercase I. Infinity with an uppercase I as an absolute, that's God, does not separate itself from the finite. So what God is an infinity, an absolute infinity, which includes within it every finite possibility. You see? And that's the transcendence of finite and infinite. Then we also have something related to that, which is limited versus unlimited. That's a common duality. But if something is unlimited, must it not include also limits? Because if a thing is unlimited, but it excludes limitation, then it's no longer unlimited, is it? It's limited in that it can't produce limitation. This is the whole trick of God. So God is unlimited with a capital U. Unlimited with a capital U means that it's unlimited in that it allows infinite limitation. It's sort of like that example of freedom and limitation that we talked about. Unlimited just means infinite freedom. Next, we have the duality of enlightened versus unenlightened. People who are unenlightened think that enlightenment is some separate thing from unenlightenment. But when you become enlightened, because enlightenment is an absolute, enlightenment with a capital E, you realize that actually there is no difference between enlightenment and unenlightenment, which is why sometimes teachers tell you that you're already enlightened. And yet, while there's a certain truth to that, it's also very misleading for those who are unenlightened. So if you're unenlightened, I actually highly recommend that you make a firm distinction between being unenlightened and being enlightened. Otherwise, you'll trick yourself thinking that you're enlightened when actually you're unenlightened. There is a difference between someone who's genuinely enlightened and someone who isn't. But after you become enlightened, you'll realize that you, in a certain sense, always were enlightened. It's a mindfuck. It's a paradox. You have to distinguish between enlightenment as we talk about it and as you imagine it, your concepts of enlightenment, and actual enlightenment with a capital E. That thing, actual enlightenment, we can't talk about it. That's something you only experience during your moment of enlightenment. You can't preview it, you can't imagine it, and nothing you imagine about it is even close to what it is. That's what makes this work so tricky. If it wasn't for that, work would be very, very easy, and we wouldn't need all this explanation, and people wouldn't get so confused and deluded. The next duality is no God versus God. And also we're going to lump in here the devil versus God. And also we'll lump in the devil versus angels. People hold all of these as total polar opposites, but in fact, they're all the same. So no God and God is the same as sort of saying atheism versus theism. Well, you can transcend atheism and theism to realize that what there is actual God. God with a capital G, which is not the same God as the theist imagines. Actually, God with a capital G is very similar to the atheist's conception of God, which is just nothingness, emptiness. But it's still not the same as atheism. And then you have the devil versus God. So people hold these as opposites, but actually, how could the devil be separate from God? Because God created everything. Therefore, God must have created the devil. If the devil created himself, that means the devil is God as well, from that perspective, you see? So either you admit that the devil created himself, in which case he's God, or you admit that he didn't create himself, in which case God created him, in which case, because God is his own creation, God is not separate from his creation, God must be the devil. So really, the devil is just a facet of God. That's what we mean by that word. Go check out my episode, What is the Devil? It's one of my most important episodes. So you can transcend the devil and God to God with an uppercase G. God with an uppercase G includes the devil within it. And that's very, very important for you to understand. Same thing with angels. The devil, according to mythology, is just a fallen angel. The devil is an angel. And also we should address here the duality between gods and God, or polytheism and monotheism. These are often presented as opposites. And oftentimes atheists will use other cultures which were polytheistic as some sort of argument against monotheism. Because supposedly, like Leo, well, how can you tell whether monotheism is true or polytheism true? Doesn't this show that your belief in God is somehow relative? Just something that, you happen to pick up from your monotheistic culture? No. God is not a belief, you got to understand. Unless it is. If it's a belief, then of course you're right. But if God, you're talking about the actual God with a capital G, it's not a belief. And so, really, polytheism is not in conflict with monotheism at all. So, you can have multiple gods. That's not a problem. It's just that you got to realize that ultimately they're all unified together under the Godhead, under formlessness. And this is exactly what you see in Hinduism, for example. They have many different gods and avatars. But then there's the ultimate, which is Shiva, which connects them all, or Brahman, connects them all. See? And that's not a contradiction. Because the very nature of God is to incarnate itself into various forms. So there might be multiple gods out there. I don't know. I haven't encountered all the possible gods that might exist. But what I am conscious of is God is an absolute, which would incorporate all of those. See? So polytheism doesn't shake you. And even the existence of other lesser gods doesn't shake you when you are conscious that you are God. And that God is an absolute, and that God is infinite, including all forms. So if there is some superhuman intelligence, some artificial AI that some aliens constructed in some universe or in some galaxy far away across the universe, you might almost call that a god. But of course, it's not the God. It's a lesser God, you might say. It's a lesser intelligence. It's still not absolute. Which is why the existence of aliens also doesn't shake non-duality. It doesn't matter if they're aliens. It doesn't matter how smart they are, or how technologically sophisticated they are, or how godlike they are, because they are still not absolute. Because they're formed, and they're limited in some fashion. If they weren't, then they would be the absolute. They'd be ultimate God, which is, of course, what I am and what you are already. You can become conscious of that. Next is the duality between temporal and eternal. This can be transcended to discover eternity with a capital E, actual eternity. This very moment, the now, right now, is an absolute. It's absolutely eternal, which means it exists outside of time, or another way to say it is that it exists forever, for trillions of years. This very moment right now that's happening, it has existed for an infinite number of years, which makes it eternal, and it makes it immortal. That's a very radical state of consciousness to become conscious of that. You need to become conscious of what absolute now is. And right now you're not conscious of it because ordinary human consciousness is temporal. It's dualistic and temporal. But time is just a concept. Time is relative. Time is not absolute, as Einstein demonstrated. Next, we have the division and duality between samsara and nirvana. Buddhist terms, which some of you might be familiar with. Samsara is the formed world, the mundane world of suffering. Nirvana is sort of the heaven realm where you are liberated and free of suffering. And people sometimes, when they get into spirituality and Buddhism, they hold these as opposites. And that the point of enlightenment and Buddhism is to escape into nirvana. But of course, this is a misunderstanding. You can't escape into nirvana because nirvana is identical to samsara. Form is formlessness. So there is sort of nirvana with a lowercase n, which is nirvana as some place that you escape to. But if there's a place that you can escape to, that means there's a place you're escaping from, which means that there's two places. That means two, that means duality, that means you're not actually non-dual, that means your non-duality is incomplete. So to truly attain nirvana is to realize that nirvana is everywhere and that you can't escape nirvana because there's only one place, here, now. This is nirvana. If you can't realize nirvana now, you never will. And then closely related to that is the duality between heaven and hell. People think that these are opposites. In fact, heaven is an absolute. Heaven with a capital H. Heaven is here right now. Heaven is nirvana. Heaven is ever present. You can't escape heaven. You can't go elsewhere to heaven because heaven is everywhere. But the problem is that you're creating a hell within your own mind. So even though you are in heaven, you don't realize you're in heaven because your ego creates its own hell. That's what the devil does. The devil is a fallen angel which creates its own hell right in the middle of God. See, because the devil is not separate from God, the devil needs to imagine that it's separate from God by creating a separation where? Within his own mind, by imagining it. And therefore he creates his own hell. Crystal clear? All right, we've gotten to the end of the list. That is over 250 dualities for you, explained, reconciled, and transcended. So there you go. Now let's issue some concluding remarks to wrap all of this together. What is the significance of all this? Well, hopefully you're starting to see it. Hopefully you're thinking through these examples and you're seeing just how radical it is, the stuff that I'm saying. I'm saying very radical stuff here. If this isn't shocking to you, if this isn't threatening to you, if this isn't triggering emotions of anger and sadness in you, then you're not getting it. You're not getting it yet. This is heavy, heavy, heavy stuff. This is all the stuff they didn't teach you in school, all the stuff that science and philosophy doesn't understand. This is all the stuff that mainstream culture doesn't teach you. And the reason it doesn't is precisely because it's so radical. It's so twisted. It's so paradoxical, and it requires lengthy explanations. And it's very nuanced and sophisticated and subtle. As you can see, you can easily fall into various kinds of traps, for example, between duality and non-duality, or samsara and nirvana and so forth. So, yeah, it took hours. How many hours did it take to explain all this? A lot. And you still don't really understand what I talked about here. We're still just scratching the surface of all the ramifications of non-duality. So, what I want you to understand is that the world is not made out of atoms. the way you've been taught. The world is made out of dualities. An atom is one instance of a duality. If you say that, oh, Leo, well, not atoms, maybe it's made out of quarks. Well, a quark is also a duality. No, Leo, not quarks, it's made out of energy. Energy is also a duality. No, Leo, it's made out of strings, superstrings. That's also a duality. No, Leo, it's made out of something else, some quantum foam stuff. That's also a duality. Anything that you say reality is, that's a duality. So what I'm telling you here is prior to, more fundamental than, and transcends any kind of scientific explanation of reality that you can give. Now you might say, but Leo, aren't dualities mental and not physical? That's a duality. You have to grasp something here which transcends language and thought. I'm asking a lot of you to understand this. It takes a lot to be able to understand what I'm saying here. It's tricky stuff. You have to actually work through it. You can't be sloppy about thinking about this stuff. The mistake you're making, if you're struggling to understand any of this, is you're trying to ground reality into some dualistic category, such as physical or non-physical, body or mind, matter or energy, life or death, real or not real, existence or non-existence. And that is your fundamental error. That will never work, because what you're assuming, tacitly assuming, is that reality has a ground. And what I'm telling you is that reality has no ground. That's what non-duality means. It's the collapse of all grounds, leading to the absolute, which is what the Buddhists call, the Zen Buddhists call, the groundless ground. Groundless with a capital G, ground with a capital G. The groundless ground is the realization that reality has no ground, and that is the ground. You get it? It's beyond words and beyond thoughts and beyond symbols. Now you might say, well, Leo, aren't you contradicting yourself all the time? You're speaking in dualities everywhere. Every video of yours I watch, you're speaking in dualities. Yes, of course. I speak in dualities. That's my point. It's impossible to not speak in dualities as long as you're speaking. Speech is dualistic. All speech contradicts itself. When taken far enough, non-duality cannot be spoken or written. And if you do speak or write about it, it will always devolve into contradictions and paradoxes. It must, because it's all-inclusive, and it's infinite and unlimited, so you can't formalize it. All attempts at formalizing reality, at mapping it, at modeling it, ultimately must fail, because all maps and formalizations, all equations, all symbols, all systems, all images, all ideas, all philosophies, all doctrines, all books are finite things occurring within infinite reality. So all of those tools that you're trying to use are too small. The problem is that you're not realizing just how vast reality is. It's absolutely infinite. And you need to directly realize that, rather than attempting to encapsulate it into some system, some symbol, or some formalization or some equation, which is why science will always fail, as it is done today, because science right now is mostly done through equations, and all equations are finite and limited. So you're never going to have a true unified theory of everything. It's always going to be a finite theory. That doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. It just means it's partial and not complete. You can have partial theories, which are practical and useful, and that they understand some very narrow facet of reality, but they don't understand the whole thing. You have to really appreciate that there's a big difference between understanding one part of reality in isolation versus understanding the totality of it. To understand the totality of it, you can't use the same methods and equations and language even that you used for understanding a little part of it. They're two different kinds of thing. So understand that any time that you speak or write non-duality, instantly you turn it into duality. And of course, therefore, don't expect my speaking to be non-dual. My speaking is dualistic. And I'm honest about that. I told you from the very beginning, many, many episodes ago, I told you that everything I say is ultimately false. Because what I do with Actualize.org is I create maps and models and theories, various kinds of simplifications, and that really my teachings are pragmatic. Don't expect my teachings to be the absolute truth. My teachings are trying to guide you towards a personal realization of the absolute truth, and I do claim that that's possible, but my teachings are not themselves absolute truth, nor will they ever be, nor have I ever been from the very beginning, from my very first video, nor have I ever been under the impression that anything I say is absolute truth. Never have I been under that impression, because I realized back when I was still in university that that's not possible. So I've never even attempted to do that with my work. For the last 20 years, I've known that. Even long before I became awoke, I understood that the truth cannot be spoken. So there's a very interesting paradox here, is that anything that your mind will say will be dualistic, including any refutation or affirmation of duality or non-duality. You got that? So, for example, if I say that reality is dual, is that true or false? It's false, technically speaking. If I say that reality is non-dual, is that true or false? It's also false, technically speaking. At the same time, there was a hint of truth in both of those statements. But yet we can't really say anything about what reality is, because the nature of reality is such that it's everything, and therefore you can't pin it down to any one thing. Therefore, anytime you say that reality is any way, technically you're wrong. So if you say reality is big, you're wrong, because reality is also small. If you say reality is red, you're wrong, because it's also blue. If you say reality is human, you're wrong, because it's also not human. If you say reality is alive, you're also wrong, because it's also not alive. See? Are you getting that? So any time that I say that reality is some way, you need to understand that I'm pointing to something. I might be getting at some partial truth, but I'm not telling you the whole truth. It's a partial truth. And that's okay. Partial truths are valuable and useful. You just have to understand that they're partial. You'd be surprised at how many people confuse partial truths with total truths. So the whole trick here is not to exclude anything accidentally. Because some people get stuck on this idea that there is a God, and other people get stuck on this idea that there isn't a God. And some people get stuck on the idea that life is unfair, and other people get stuck on the idea that life is good and it's all fair in the end. Who's right? Well, it's all of that and more and none. It's everything. See? The mistake is believing that you can say reality is blank. You can't say that. The truest thing you could say is that reality is blank, and leave it a blank, because that's what it is. That blank signifies nothing and everything. You could fill that blank in with whatever you want. That's the nature of reality. It gives you total freedom. It's like a variable that is allowed to be anything that it wants to be. Like a universal variable. So, one thing you should take away from everything in this series is that from now on, do not let anyone ever again fool you with dualistic categories. People will try to fool you because they themselves are fooled and operating from duality. So your teacher or your professor or some book that you're reading or some guru you're listening to or some political person, commentator that you listen to, they will try to frame reality in some sort of dualistic fashion using their categories without being conscious that they created these categories. And they will try to foist these categories upon you. They will try to get you to accept these categories as absolute truths. And I want you to be wise enough to realize that they are deluded and not to buy into their categories. Because reality cannot be categorized because it is infinite. At the same time, this is very, very important. I am not saying that various categorization schemes are useless and are bad. I'm not saying that. In fact, to navigate life effectively, you need to be able to wisely create categories that are functional in various kinds of domains. So it's not about rejecting all categories again. It's about being aware of the trickeries of how categories work and being skillful at navigating them, being skillful at drawing them and redrawing them, constructing them and deconstructing them. See? So again, anything that you think I'm saying which is exclusionary is you misunderstanding what I'm saying. So if I'm bad-mouthing science, I'm not saying we need to exclude science. I'm saying we need to go beyond science. If I'm bad-mouthing categories, I'm not saying to abandon categories. I'm saying we got to go beyond categories. If I'm bad-mouthing some political ideology that I don't agree with, I'm not saying that it has no function or that it shouldn't exist. I'm saying that we got to go beyond it, that it's partial. All divisions are limited, partial, and temporary. All divisions are creations which must ultimately collapse back into source, which is emptiness or the groundless ground. Let's quickly go over one more time what the absolutes are. Let's sort of unify all the absolutes together that we mentioned throughout this whole list. And all of these terms that I'll be speaking right now are going to be uppercase letters. So, for example, truth with an uppercase T, that's an absolute. Actual with an uppercase A is an absolute. Existence, being, consciousness, goodness, love, intelligence, beauty, fairness, power, order, mind, selflessness, the self, wisdom, unlimited, unity, oneness, wholeness, infinity, absolute, of course, non-duality, heaven, life, creation, enlightenment, spirit, God, happiness, peace, perfection, divinity, eternity, immortality, and mystery. All of these are absolutes. But the trick is that any ideas that you have about what these are not the absolute. They're just ideas, relative ideas. But what you can do is you can do practices like meditation, self-inquiry, psychedelics, yoga, and so forth to become conscious of the actual absolutes, which I cannot communicate to you here other than in this dualistic relative fashion, which I'm doing. Got it? Good. But you still are probably wondering, but Leo, there's so many of these absolutes. How many of them are there? Shouldn't there only be one absolute? Are you saying there's only one, but then they all seem different? You know, what does love have to do with infinity, and what does that have to do with eternity and so forth? Well, of course, when you ask the question, how many absolutes are there? You're sneaking in an implicit duality of one versus many. Because you're asking the question, is there one absolute or are there many absolutes? And the answer is, oneness is identical to manyness, as we've mentioned up above. So the absolute is tricky in this sense in that it is one. The absolute is one. But at the same time, it's also many. It's a whole that contains many parts, or a good way to think of it, it's like a diamond with many facets to it. And so when you're doing psychedelic trips, or you're doing yoga or whatever, you become conscious of various aspects of the things that I said. You're never going to become conscious of everything that I said all at once. It's way too much. Way too much. You're going to be glimpsing facets, kind of like looking at a diamond and only seeing 1 or 2 or 3 facets at once, but not the whole thing. And you have to kind of like spin it around, look at it from every angle to get a full sense of what it is. You see? And a good metaphor that they have in the Hindu traditions and in Buddhism as well, I think, is the blind men and the elephant parable, where you have an elephant and you have these 5 blind men, and each blind man is feeling some different part of the elephant. One of them is feeling the foot, another one is feeling the tail, another is feeling the tusks, another is feeling the snout or the nose, another one is feeling the side, and each one explains what he's feeling, but he can't see because he's blindfolded. So the one groping the tail says it's like a rope. The one groping the leg says it's like a tree trunk. The one feeling the side of the elephant says it's like a wall. The one feeling the tusk says it's like some pointy thing. And the one feeling the nose says it's like a snake. So who is correct? Well, of course, they all are in a sense, because they're describing a part of one whole elephant. It's one elephant, but they're describing different parts. To really understand an elephant, you got to really like examine all the different parts closely. And it would be a mistake for you to carve up the elephant into parts, like, get a butcher knife, kill the elephant, and then cut up every part of the elephant, because you don't have the full elephant at that point. You've split it up into divisions. You've fragmented it. That might be useful if you want to learn about each individual part, but if you want to understand the whole elephant in its totality, you got to stand far back and get a good overall view of the whole thing. And that's what we're doing here. So, you might wonder at this point, well, Leo, but what's the point of all of this philosophy? The point is that your mind and your culture has fragmented reality, just like carving up an elephant with a butcher knife. And now it's time to put all these pieces back together. And no one is going to do it but you. Your culture, your society, your family, your friends, they're not going to do it for you. Science is not going to do it for you. Your guru is not going to do it for you. Only you can do it, because ultimately you are the one who created all these divisions. Not somebody else, but you. You need to take responsibility for all the dividing that you've done. And you need to repent for your devilish divisionary ways, and you need to awaken to unity with a capital U. So your job in this life is to embrace all of yourself. All of yourself. Not some parts that you like. All of yourself, especially those parts of yourself that you hate. Those parts of the world that you hate. Those parts that you don't believe are you. You need to especially embrace those and become conscious that they're you. So, the trick, though, is that you need to do this unification without actually destroying the forms and the opposites. Because it's possible to do a simplistic, naive, sloppy unification wherein you reject division, you reject evil and hatred, because you think that everybody should just love each other and there should be peace and no war, and there should be happiness and no sadness, and there should be good politicians but not bad politicians, and there should be unification but not division. But if you do it that way, then you fail to actually unify the divisions, because a true absolute unification means that you accept division. You're tolerant of it because your nature is division. You see? Also, it's very important that as you're doing this unification, that you don't remove distinctions. Unification is not a lack of distinction. You can have infinite distinctions and unify them all. So I'm not saying that you become some simple-minded fool who can't tell the difference between a man and a woman, a cat and a dog, a murder and some charity work, or your right hand and your left hand. You can still distinguish all these things. But at the same time, you can realize that all of them are part of the full bouquet and diversity of yourself. And you can embrace them all without hating them. You can even embrace hatred without hating the hater. Such that when you see people on TV who are hateful and racists and terrorists and dictators and corrupt politicians, you look at them and you say, that's me. That's what reality is. That's truth. That's God. Now, also, it doesn't mean that you can't stop them or vote against them in an election, or that you have to condone their actions and support their actions by contributing money to them. You can stop them. So if there's some politician you don't like, you can vote against him. That's okay. The point is that you don't hate him, and the point is that you understand why he is the way he is, and that you understand that he is you. You see? Your unification needs to be so all-encompassing that you even embrace division and evil. That's how deep your love needs to go. You need to love indiscriminately, which does not mean that you abide devilry and that you tolerate people doing evil stuff around you and that you become a doormat for devils. That is not what I'm saying. Get that out of your stupid mind. Awakening doesn't make you stupid and simple-minded. Awakening actually makes you a more sophisticated and careful thinker. It increases your capacity to make distinctions, but at the same time, it frees you of all distinctions and it makes you aware of unity. That's true non-duality. Let's do an exercise right now for unification of duality. Think of any duality where you favor one side over another side. So for example, masculine versus feminine. Maybe you favor one over the other. Capitalism versus socialism. Maybe you favor one over the other. People versus corporations. Science versus religion. Logic versus emotions. Good versus evil, and so forth. Find one example right now where you have a preference for one over the other and where you tend to discredit, judge, hate, and demonize the other pole. For example, you might think that masculinity is good and that femininity is bad. Feminism has been ruining men and setting men back, and so forth. So you found that example for yourself? Good. Now, unify them together. Realize that one is intimately related to the other, one is defined in terms of the other, and that actually both of them are you. Your true nature includes both. So if you hate feminism, then you need to acknowledge that actually feminism is you. You created feminism. There's nothing wrong with feminism. It shouldn't not exist because it does. Feminism is true because it exists. And you need to embrace it as part of yourself. Now, does that mean that you need to go put on lipstick if you're a man and high heels and walk around outdoors in high heels? No. You can still distinguish masculine from feminine. You can still act feminine. I mean, you can still act masculine if you want to. That's fine. People have preferences there. I'm not saying that you need to be a half man, half woman hybrid or some someone who doesn't act masculine when it feels right for you if you're a man. I'm just saying you need to realize the deeper unity between these things. Acknowledge the value and importance of that inferior, marginalized half that you've been hating, judging, and rejecting. That's difficult to do. I'm asking your mind to do something it doesn't want to do, because we get our attachments, to one pole or another pole, like we're really attached to capitalism or socialism or to science or to religion, to the exclusion of the other one. But this is where real growth happens, is when you learn to do this unification. This is how you transcend hatred. This is how you transcend having a shadow. This is how you transcend pathologies within spirituality and personal development, is by doing these sorts of unifications. So remember, this exercise is not something you just do once. This is something you can keep doing for months. Every single day you can find some new thing, some new duality, and you can unify it together using this exercise. So I highly recommend that you spend some time really working with this in your journal, in your commonplace book. This is something you want to keep returning to again and again, because this is actually a part of shadow work, and I'll talk about shadow work in the future because I know you guys want that episode. But here's the beginning of shadow work right here. To integrate your shadow, unify all dualities. The key mistake of Spiral Dynamics Stage Blue, Religion and Morality, is that the ego is so eager at that level of development to grasp the absolute truth that in fact it turns the truth into an absolute belief, clinging to some relative human categories. So the whole tragedy of dogmatic religious people, whether they're Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, Christians, or Muslims, is that they have mistaken their beliefs in the absolute for the actual absolute. And it's precisely that clinging to their belief which is keeping them from actualizing God, Christ, Shiva, Allah, Yahweh, and whatever else. See? With this clinging, it leads to absolutistic behavior, authoritarian, tribal, devilish behavior. And it leads to a fundamental inability to understand evil. And of course, if you are not able to understand evil, that means that you will commit evil. So the tragedy is that those people in the world who are most passionate about eradicating evil are precisely the source of the majority of the evil in the world. Ta-da! Which is why Spiral Dynamics Stage Blue is so dangerous and so problematic. And right now, upwards of 70% of the entire population on Earth is Spiral Dynamics Stage Blue or lower. That's a big problem. That's where a lot of evil comes from. So, of course, we can't demonize them for being at stage blue. They're not wrong for being at stage blue. It can't be helped. It's just evolution. It's development. It's how it has to be. But at the same time, we do want to help them to evolve upward out of blue. We need to help the rest of the world evolve out of blue. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of evil and a lot of devilry, and the entire world might ultimately collapse. So from now on, when you think about the world, I want you to be hyper aware of the dualities in your thinking. I want you to question every category and attempt to deconstruct it, at least as an intellectual exercise, just to begin with. ask yourself some of the following questions when you're trying to deconstruct a category. What is this category grounded in? For example, the category of masculine versus feminine, what's it actually grounded in? What's its substance? What's its reality? Notice that whatever you ground it in will itself be another duality and category. So you're going to want to ask then about that one, what's that one grounded in? And what's that one grounded in? And so you keep going down the chain until you get to the very bottom, until you realize that it's grounded in nothing. And that's correct. It's grounded in nothing. Also ask yourself this question. How does this category contain aspects of its opposite? For example, with masculine versus feminine, you might say, Leo, the masculine doesn't contain any aspects of the feminine. But of course it does. They're deeply interrelated, because the more masculine you are, for example, the more attracted you are to feminine females. So isn't it ironic that some of the most masculine men, who oftentimes have a hatred for femininity and for feminism on some ideological level, at the same time, they're actually in love and get sexually excited by the most feminine females? And you see how twisted and fucked up that is? Also ask yourself this question. How are both sides of this category good with an uppercase G? So for example, if you think that feminism is bad and evil and so forth, ask yourself, but how is it good? How is it good in the larger scheme of things? And what you might discover then is, you might discover, well, if I have a daughter in the future, it's going to be good that there was a feminist movement that gave her equal rights, so she can open a bank account and have her own credit card, so that she can drive her own car, so that she's not wearing some burqa like they do in Saudi Arabia, so that she can get a divorce if she's married to some asshole who abuses her, because our legal system gives her the right to do that. Whereas, for example, in certain countries, like in Saudi Arabia, a woman, she can get raped and she can't even report it to the police or to the court system, because their culture and their law is so backwards that actually they will blame the woman for the rape. And they will say, well, if she got raped, then she's actually, she's like the frivolous one. She's the indecent one. And so she deserves punishment for the fact that she got raped. You see? So isn't it nice that we have a feminist movement here in America or in Europe that has done away with some of those really crude, archaic gender differences within society? Isn't that nice? If you have a daughter, see, that changes your perspective a lot. Or if you want to go even more radical, consider this. In the next lifetime, after this lifetime is over, you have a 50-50 chance of being born as a woman. So wouldn't it be nice, if you're born as a woman, that there is such a thing as feminism? See? So try that. Another question you can ask yourself is, how am I clinging to this category? You should be able to go inside of yourself, introspect, and feel an emotional attachment or clinginess to whatever pole of this duality that you're clinging to. So if you're a male, you're going to have this sort of need, this need to argue with me. Leo, I got a bunch of arguments for why feminism is evil and bad, and all of your arguments are wrong, and Leo, you're bad, you're deluded, and you're stupid, and you're a social justice, all this. See? That's what I mean. That's a clinging that you have. Feel that. Rather than being carried away with it, feel it. And observe that clinginess. Realize that that's not healthy. It's not true. That's your attachment, and that's your ego, that's your delusion that you got to work through. And lastly, ask yourself the question, how am I trying to ground all of reality into some kind of duality? What is the most fundamental duality for you? Is it a duality between self and world, between God and the devil, between matter and mind? And you just keep insisting that matter is what's true. Leo, it's matter. Everything's matter. Or Leo, everything is rational. Or Leo, everything is just energy. That's how you're grounding reality. Look at that very, very carefully. In conclusion, I just want to stress that you will not transcend duality through thought. You cannot access the absolute through thought. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not useful to think about this stuff. You got to start somewhere. You can't just go from hearing this lecture and then jumping straight into full God realization of the absolute like that. Like, it's not going to happen. You got to start to think about this stuff, because thinking is all you know how to do at this point. So yeah, so think about it, contemplate it. It's all going to be really good. It's going to be part of a deconstruction process. You're loosening up your mind. You're opening yourself up. And then you can do meditation, concentration, yoga, psychedelics to really access the absolute. So you're going to need both. This is extremely tricky stuff. Extremely tricky stuff. If you're a psychedelic user and you like to trip, I recommend that you spend a lot of time contemplating these dualities prior to your trips. And then, when you go into your trip, try to actually work on one of these dualities. Pick one to focus on. Maybe the one of like devil versus God, or sane versus insane, although that one's tricky. Good versus bad, or matter versus energy. Pick one that appeals to you, that you're most fascinated by, and then try to work with that and contemplate it while you're in the middle of your trip. And what you should discover is that your trips become so much more profound, and they become much more practical, and you can grow so much from them. And then also you have now a roadmap for hundreds of trips into the future. How many trips do you want to do? You want to do 100 trips where every trip you dedicate to one of these dualities? I have 250 dualities for you here. That's 250 trips worth at least. And actually, some of these dualities are so profound that you'll need to trip multiple times on each one. Like, for example, the duality between self and other, or self and God. That one, you can do 10, 20, 30 trips just on that duality to really fully plumb the depths of what that really means. And if you do that, you'll be one highly woke motherfucker if you succeed in that. Of course, be careful. It won't be easy. To transcend all these dualities will be the work of your lifetime. It is the reason that you're here on this earth, is to understand this stuff, to understand yourself as God. So there you go. But the question is, did you actually fathom the depth of what was said here in this series? Be careful. Don't assume that you did. This is very advanced stuff. I don't know anything more advanced than this. This is a very profound topic. It's not enough to just talk about it. You really got to experience it. You have to really do some serious deconstruction on yourself. Conceptual understanding will not be enough, but it's a good place to start. So let's start there. As always, don't believe what I said. Verify for yourself. Don't treat me as any kind of authority figure. Nothing I say hinges on my authority. It all hinges on direct experience. So my claim is very empirical. My claim is that if you explore these dualities for yourself, you will find that they will collapse. And many of the things that I said here will seem very true for you. That's my claim. I could be wrong, so verify for yourself. hey, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm deluded, maybe I'm crazy. You don't know. From your point of view, you don't know. Don't trust me. Verify. Do the research. Do your own experiments. Be a good scientist. Be a good philosopher. And that is the end. All right. But of course, as we've talked about, the end is always a new beginning. So there's much more to come. Please click that like button for me. Come also check out actualize.org. Look at my blog. I'm posting new stuff there all the time. Check out the Life Purpose course. Check out the forum. Ask your questions there. I spend a lot of my energy and time on the forum answering people's questions, so make good use of it. And the last thing that I'll tell you is that, yes, these are very long-winded episodes, multiple parts, but you will be rewarded for sticking through it. This work takes dedication. This is not something you do by just browsing through YouTube randomly, watching a video here or watching a video there, screwing around. This really takes serious work. This is radical and cutting-edge stuff. And I know that at times it can seem impractical and very abstract and philosophical. But there's a method to the madness. There's a deeper wisdom here that I'm trying to guide you towards. And you have to have a certain kind of vision and faith that it's going to pay off. The work, the time that you spend studying, taking notes, just even listening to videos, maybe listening to them multiple times, contemplating for yourself. All of this is a lot of work. Yes, it's a distraction from your business and from your family and from whatever stupid stuff you do every day. But on the other hand, what else is there to do in life? You got something better to do? You got somewhere else to be? That's more important than this? Who else is talking to you like this? Who else is teaching you these things? Who else is explaining this stuff at this level of depth to you? This is rare stuff, so don't take it for granted. Remember that our goal here is to build a massive skyscraper. We're not just building a simple little 3-story house. We're building a massive skyscraper with your personal development and your spirituality. So that's what your life is going to be. It's going to be a massive skyscraper, and that's going to take a big investment, a bigger one than building a 3-story house. And that's going to require time to really dig and lay a proper foundation, which is going to be able to bear the weight of this massive structure that you're going to build on top of it in this work. So don't get discouraged. Console yourself in your toughest times when you feel depressed, when you feel lazy, when you feel like you're not getting the results that you've been expecting, that it's taking longer than you thought, when you're struggling, when you're frustrated, when you've got some emotional issue that you're struggling with. And just keep reminding yourself that you're doing all this for some very large vision in the end. We're not working towards something small here. We're not just working towards $1 million. We're not just working to some relationship. We're working towards omniscience of the entire universe. We're working towards immortality. We're working towards total God realization. We're working towards sainthood. We're working towards infinite love. We're working towards infinite understanding. This is what we're working towards. So yeah, it's going to take some work. It's going to take some time. Be patient. Hold the vision. Learn how to motivate yourself. Pace yourself. Build momentum over time. Invest in the practices gradually. It's a lot of stuff. It's very easy to get overwhelmed because I share so much. I can see how this would be so overwhelming for most newcomers. So you're going to have to break it up into piece by piece and eat the elephant one piece at a time, as they say. And of course, understand that everything that I've talked about so far is still just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more, which is why you should stick around. There's many new topics that are coming, stuff that I haven't ever said before. So don't just think that I'm a broken record and that all I talk about is duality and non-duality. No, there's a ton of other stuff. You'll be amazed and shocked by all the practical and useful stuff that I'll have for you in the future. So make sure you stay tuned for that.